"You're such a terrible wife, so boring and useless." That's what I hear every day from my husband, Troy, and his sister, Catherine. They never stop insulting me. "Get out of this house, you worthless wife, you don't even do your chores." Even my mother-in-law, Jennifer, joined in. She yelled at me, threw salt all over me, and some even got into my mouth. It was disgusting. Then Jennifer handed me some papers. "Here you go, these are your divorce papers." It was obvious they had planned this together. I took the papers, signed them, and packed my things to leave. "Well, that's it," I said. "You should all be thankful I even stayed this long to take care of you. Hi, I'm Cynthia, a 30-year-old office worker. I've been married to Troy for 2 years. We met on a blind date. Back then, Troy worked at a small company. He was the one who showed interest in me first. He seemed kind, responsible, and hardworking, even though he was 2 years younger. I thought he'd make a good partner, so we started dating. Troy was sweet and thoughtful while we were dating. He planned our dates, treated me well, and made me feel cared for. Eventually, I fell for him, and we got married. In the beginning, everything was great. We both worked, shared the chores, and had a happy life together. For 2 years, I was genuinely happy. Then one day, Troy quit his job without telling me. "Why did you quit your job so suddenly?" I asked, shocked. "I realized I'm not cut out for office work," he said casually. "Why didn't you talk to me about this first?" "I thought you'd always support me, Cynthia." "I do support you, but big decisions like this need to be discussed." "My bad, I just wanted to quit," he said, shrugging it off. I was surprised. I didn't know he hated his job so much. For now, it was okay because I earned enough to support us, but I wanted him to find a new job soon. 2 weeks later, Troy had another surprise. "Hey, Cynthia, I'm going to open a boba tea shop," he said excitedly. "What? Are you serious? It's cheap to start, and I can rent a small space." "Troy, do you have any experience in food service, like working in a cafe or restaurant?" "Nope." "Then how will you run a boba tea shop? Without experience, it might fail, and you might lose money." "Why are you being so negative? Let me try first." "I'm not against the idea, but starting something like this without preparation or experience doesn't seem wise." "I don't care, I want to be my own boss." Troy ignored my advice and started planning the shop. I told him he'd have to do it on his own because I couldn't support an idea that felt so risky. To my surprise, Troy managed to set up the shop all on his own. He designed it, came up with a theme, and got everything ready for the grand opening. When I saw the finished shop, I was impressed. It had a cozy atmosphere, and the location wasn't bad either. For a moment, I thought maybe his idea could actually work. But reality hit quickly. The boba tea trend was no longer popular. Only a few loyal boba fans came to the shop, but there weren't enough of them to keep the business going. On top of that, Troy's lack of experience showed. He was slow at making drinks, and by the time they were served, the ice had melted, leaving the tea watery and unappealing. Because of this, the shop didn't get regular customers, any buzz, or profits. I knew that in the food service industry, it's normal to not make money in the first year, but it was clear that Troy's shop was heading for failure. I suggested he close the shop before things got worse. "I just started this business. I'm not quitting now," he said angrily. "Why can't you motivate me, Cynthia? Why are you being so negative?" When Troy got like this, he refused to listen to reason and instead took his frustration out on me. But I couldn't support his reckless idea anymore. If he didn't close the shop, we'd lose even more money and end up in debt. "Troy, can't you see this isn't working? Starting a shop without proper planning or experience was a bad idea. If you're serious about succeeding in the food industry, why not work in a cafe or restaurant first to gain some experience?" I tried to make him understand, but he refused to listen. I felt completely stuck. Then, the next day, he hit me with another shocking idea. "Let's move in with my mom," he said casually. "What? Why would we do that?" I asked. "If we live with her, we won't have to pay rent. Even if my shop makes little money, we'll be fine. Plus, Mom's been lonely since Dad passed away." "I think moving in with my mom would be a good way to take care of her," Troy said, trying to convince me. But honestly, I didn't like the idea of living with his mom, Jennifer. Jennifer had always been cold and rude to me. During holidays like Thanksgiving and Christmas, whenever we visited her, she acted like she couldn't stand me. While she hadn't treated me horribly as Troy's wife, I knew living with her would be a nightmare. Troy, however, didn't back down. Besides, he added, if my income is small, we won't have to worry about rent if we move in with her. It'll save us money, and since Dad passed away, she's been living alone. I hated to admit it, but financially, his argument made sense. If he kept running his boba tea shop without a steady income, we wouldn't be able to pay our bills. So, reluctantly, I agreed to move in with Jennifer, for now. That's when my life with Jennifer began, and it didn't take long for things to go downhill. Cynthia, stop standing around and get to work, clean the house, do the laundry, and cook dinner. You're so slow, Jennifer shouted. You're the wife of a boba tea shop owner, so stop being useless and pull your weight. Her yelling started on the very first day. I already had a bad feeling about this arrangement. As for Troy, he didn't care. He acted like nothing was happening, even though it was clear I was struggling. But Jennifer wasn't the only problem. There was also Catherine, my sister-in-law. After moving in, I found out Catherine had divorced her husband and was now living with Jennifer along with her daughter, Elizabeth. One day, Catherine snapped at me, Cynthia, why is there no ice cream in the fridge? Because your daughter ate 2 of them yesterday, I replied. What? That's not the point. When you see there's no ice cream, you should go out and buy more. You're such an inconsiderate wife. Catherine and Jennifer constantly found reasons to criticize me, no matter what I did. And Troy? He just sat on the couch, scrolling through his phone, completely ignoring everything happening around him. Within just a few days of moving in, I was already at my breaking point. I soon found out that Jennifer's house still had a 35-year mortgage, and she was using my late father-in-law's inheritance and pension to pay for it. Neither Jennifer nor Catherine worked. Despite this, Jennifer demanded money from us. If you're going to live here, you need to contribute. I want $2,000 a month for living expenses, she said. This made no sense to me. Troy had told me we wouldn't have to pay rent, which was the whole reason I agreed to move in, but now Jennifer was treating us like tenants. Still, I paid her without complaining because Troy reassured me. Sales at my shop are picking up, he said confidently, just give it a little more time. I believed him and decided to wait for 3 more months. During this time, Jennifer and Catherine kept bullying me. One day, I decided to visit Troy's boba tea shop without telling him. To my shock, the shop was completely empty. I stayed and watched for a while, but no customers came. That's when I realized Troy had been lying to me. At the same time, I had a big success at work, earning a promotion. My new role required more time and energy, so I often worked overtime or started early. This left me with less time for household chores. Even though I was busier, Jennifer and Catherine refused to help around the house. Housework is the wife's job, they said. With no help, the house became messy, the laundry piled up, and dust covered the rooms. Instead of helping, they blamed me for everything. Even Troy started criticizing me. You're a terrible wife, he said, you're so boring and dull. The verbal abuse from Jennifer and Catherine got worse. One day, Jennifer grabbed a handful of salt and threw it at me. It covered my clothes, and some even got into my mouth. It was disgusting. That was the final straw for me. Despite paying rent, working hard, and doing my best, I was treated horribly. Things got even worse when they accused me of having an affair. You're just using your overtime as an excuse to see someone else, Jennifer yelled. Troy joined in, saying, Cynthia, how could you cheat on me while I'm working so hard on my business? Jennifer then handed me divorce papers that Troy had already signed. I had had enough. I signed the papers, packed my things, and left the house. As I walked out, Jennifer and Catherine smirked. Good riddance, you deserve to be alone, they said. Looking back, I regretted all the sacrifices I made for them, but as I walked away, I felt a huge sense of relief. I was finally free. As I was leaving, I turned to my in-laws and said firmly, with a hint of sarcasm, well, this is it. You all should be thanking me for taking care of you. I know you'll be in trouble without me. Good luck, you'll need it. Their eyes widened in shock, and they started making a fuss, but I didn't care. I ignored them and walked out. I filed the divorce papers right away, rented a cozy apartment for myself, and started living a peaceful life. Why didn't I do this sooner? Looking back, I regretted not leaving earlier, but now, I was finally free, and my life became calm and stress-free. Strangely, Jennifer, my ex-mother-in-law, kept trying to call me after I left. Maybe she hadn't finished bullying me, or maybe she'd realized the truth about their financial situation. Either way, I ignored her. I blocked her number, knowing that dealing with her would only bring more problems. A year passed quickly, and I moved on with my life, but one day, I got a call from an unknown number. At first, I didn't want to answer, but I thought it might be work-related, so I picked up. To my surprise, it was Jennifer. "Cynthia," she said, "finally, you answered. You blocked my old number, didn't you?" Of course, I had blocked her after all the annoying calls. "What do you want?" I asked, already exhausted by the sound of her voice. "I'll get straight to the point," she said. "We need you to come back." What are you talking about?" I asked, confused. "We're in serious trouble," Jennifer admitted. "Troy told me his boba tea shop hasn't made any profit in a year. He's been using his share of the inheritance to pay rent for the shop. That's when I realized you were the one supporting us financially this whole time." "I'm glad you've finally realized all of this. I wish you had told me sooner," I said. "Are you really going to talk to me like this now?" "I'm the only one you can rely on," Jennifer replied, sounding desperate. "I'm sorry, please, I won't be mean anymore. Please come back to the family," she begged. I could tell Jennifer was serious, but I couldn't bring myself to forgive her. I understood it must be hard for her to handle everything on her own, 2 grown children with no jobs, a huge mortgage to pay, and no help, but after all the mistreatment, I was done. "I'm sorry, but I will never forgive you," I replied coldly. "There's no chance we'll get back together. If you can't pay the mortgage, why not sell the house?" There was a pause before Jennifer spoke again. "Well, Troy's been in debt for a long time, so even selling the house won't cover everything." "That's not my problem," I said. "I'm divorced, and you're the one who called me worthless." "Oh," I said that in anger. "I didn't mean it. I don't care anymore. I'm a stranger to you now. You're on your own," I said, and hung up. Later, a mutual friend told me what happened to Troy and his family. They couldn't pay the mortgage and had to sell the house, but it went for much less than expected, and they were still left with a lot of debt. Troy's boba tea shop was also losing money, so they were all working part-time jobs to pay off their debts. Meanwhile, I had been promoted at work, and my salary increased. I was finally spending money on myself and living happily. Looking back, I realized Troy had always been irresponsible and immature. His sister Catherine and his mother Jennifer were even worse. I had endured too much living with that toxic family. In the end, I'm glad Troy's boba tea shop failed. He should have gained some experience before starting his own business. Now, I'm happy and peaceful, living my own life. Thank you for watching until the end. Please subscribe to our channel and hit the like button. See you in the next video.
The attractive blonde known as Katie Starr on the World Wide Web smiled dazzlingly while looking at herself in the mirror and filming the event on her phone camera. "Well, my lovely subscribers, I can't believe this day has come," she purred, turning to be in the frame. "I couldn't sleep a wink last night. I only hope that my wonderful makeup artist can fix the situation with some magic makeup and hide those shadows under my eyes. Otherwise, my fiancé will run away when he picks up my veil at the altar." Katie laughed gleefully, then raised the camera higher, showing the audience 2 girls who were fluttering beside her like bees. "These are my fairy godmothers for today. Hey girls, wave your hands." Katie introduced the masters and gave them a chance to smile at the phone screen, then shifted her attention back to herself. "Anyway, my darlings, soon you'll see my wedding look. You know, it makes me want to cry to think that today I'm going to be Brandon's wife. I've been dreaming about it since I was a little girl. I imagined I'd walk to the archway lined with flowers where my Prince Charming would be waiting for me. And now, my dream is about to become a reality. You know, I hope your dreams will come true too. Don't stop believing in them. And of course, don't stop liking my posts. I will continue to share my life with you with all possible sincerity. Love, kisses, and see you soon." Katie sent an air kiss to the screen and pressed the red button on the phone, stopping the recording. However, as soon as she stopped recording, the radiant smile slid off her face, giving way to irritation. She reviewed the recording and grudgingly grinned. "I have a pale face. I'll scare away all my subscribers with this face," she complained to her friend Zoe. The cheerful tone of the blogger and her smile disappeared. Zoe thoughtfully looked at the bride's appearance. "You're tanned, Katie. You've recently returned from vacation," she reassured her friend. But Katie did not accept the compliment. She twitched and exclaimed angrily, looking in the mirror at the hairdresser, "Hey, are you trying to leave me without hair? Can't you be neater? I paid a lot of money to have these blonde curls on my head, and you just take them out and pull out my hair. Damn it, what a good-for-nothing specialist you are." "Excuse me?" The hairdresser responded laconically, brushing her client's hair with more care. It should be noted that she was already doing her work carefully and thoroughly. However, Katie always found something to complain about. In the room of the country mansion, located near the beautiful lake, there were 4 girls: Katie, her maid of honour, and only friend Zoe, a hairdresser and a makeup artist. The beauty workers were doing their best to prepare the bride, but the capricious girl was not satisfied with the result. Katie did not have a pleasant character or tolerance even on ordinary days, and today, on the day of her wedding, she completely tormented the others. She had already forced the makeup artist to wash off the foundation from her face, adding caustic comments like, "What are you doing? I'll put on better makeup myself. Will you stop slowing down? I can't sit around all day waiting for you to learn how to put on makeup." The woman, who had not even begun to apply makeup to the stubborn bride, did not argue. She washed off the rudiments of makeup from her face, then reapplied it the same way. But this time, Katie, having evaluated the result of the makeup artist's labours, nodded. "Well, now it's okay. Not perfect, of course, but it will do." She haughtily praised the makeup artist. The girl only pressed her lips together, suppressing a chuckle. She did not take such criticism seriously, although her colleague, the hairdresser, was already beginning to shake with nerves. To relax that morning, the bride and her maid of honour decided to open a bottle of sparkling wine, and they had to open 2 bottles to shoot the moment on video. The first time, Katie thought that not enough foam came out, but she needed a perfect video for her blog. Zoe only shrugged her shoulders, philosophically deciding that the more champagne she opened and poured into herself today, the easier it would be for her to endure her girlfriend's antics. After the first glass, the maid of honour decided to make a couple of videos too. However, Katie was once again dissatisfied. "Zoe, are you filming? Turn it off immediately," she shrieked. "But you wanted me to." She paused and quoted Katie. "Capture every moment of this momentous day for history." Katie snorted and rolled her eyes toward the ceiling. "Oh, but you have to use your head, right? And not just do whatever they tell you to do," the bride grumbled. "I'm filming for subscribers. They're not interested in looking at my pimples. They want the perfect picture, you know. One day, I took one picture of myself with almost no makeup on, and I'm done with it. Besides, you took pictures of me on my left side. How many times do I have to tell you that you should be on the right?" Zoe snorted and changed the phone to a glass. "Are you not positioning yourself as a person close to the simple, ordinary girls, a friend for everyone who will advise on cosmetics and share secrets?" Katie wanted to object to the naive friend and explain that business cannot be done with sincerity, but she caught a glimpse of her reflection and sharply rose. "You're an armless fool. What kind of eyebrows are you making?" "By your shape, natural eyebrows," started to explain the makeup artist. "You are a bride, your image should be natural and gentle. Isn't that what you wanted? Softness and natural shape are the trend now." "Draw natural eyebrows for yourself." Katie got angry, blushing even through the thick foundation. "I want them wider. Okay, redo it." "I wouldn't speak so arrogantly with a person who can make a clown out of you with one stroke of a brush," giggled Zoe, plumping on the sofa with a glass of sparkling wine. Her words did not embarrass Katie. She twitched her shoulder. "They're attendants, Zoe. I pay them money and I expect to get a decent favour," she remarked, not the least bit worried that the makeup artist could hear her. "So they either do their job right in a way that I like, or get the hell out. Right, girls?" The aforementioned girls looked at each other but continued to work in silence. Humility was written on their faces, and they desired to finish the job as quickly as possible and then leave the room and forget Katie as a nightmare. Katie took her glass from the dressing table and emptied it halfway in one gulp. After smacking her plump lips, the shape of which she had recently corrected with filler, she looked at the screen of her phone again. She smiled contentedly, turning to her friend. "Before the wedding, I had so many new subscribers," she boasted. "It will be a sensation. I'm sure there will be more offers from advertisers. There it is, the fame. Oh, I have no doubt it will be an extravaganza, not a wedding," she skeptically remarked to her friend. However, Katie Starr, elated by her success, did not hear the irony in her friend's voice. She enjoyed looking at the comments under her publications. Katie Starr's real name was Catherine McCann. The girl was from a wealthy family. Of course, her parents spoiled her and raised her like a princess. But not the kind who needed to know etiquette, foreign languages and ballroom dancing. Katie was allowed to do everything, but she preferred not to do anything and just skim the cream off this life. At some point, she realized that she wanted to brag about her luxurious life to a large audience. That's how she became a blogger. The party girl persona quickly grew stale, leaving her audience bored. Then, the girl created a new image that was close to the people. She began to show an audience of many thousands how she helped orphanages and orphans, how she went to art galleries and benefit evenings, not just fashion shows and nightclubs. However, this lifestyle began to consume her like quicksand. She indulged in ostentatious living, filming every moment for her subscribers. A year ago, she met Brandon Arnett, a handsome young man who was not born into wealth, but built his own custom jewelry company from scratch. The company quickly gained popularity and made Brandon a fortune. Brandon and Katie met at an advertising shoot. The PR manager of the company invited Katie as a model, paying her for advertising on her blog. Of course, at first, the young man liked Katie outwardly, a beautiful blonde with a naive look of blue eyes and a sincere smile could fall into the heart of any man. Then they started dating. Soon, Brandon noticed the differences between the two Katies, the one next to him and the one who appeared in front of the camera. However, he turned a blind eye to her shortcomings because he had fallen in love. The blogger insisted on a quick wedding, and she realized that she wanted to rekindle the interest of the public. She even asked Brandon to propose on camera, although he was modest and preferred to keep such moments intimate. However, who would refuse the bride's request? Katie did not miss the chance of the news hook. The event was preceded by several months of wedding discussions. In the comments, subscribers were wondering, what kind of dress will the bride have? What hairstyle? And what kind of cake? Once Katie achieved this, she didn't want to stop. Recently, she noticed that the subscribers of a pregnant model were literally going crazy, guessing the gender of her future child. When Katie, without hiding her envy, read the comments under the posts of her competitor, she realized her next step: a beautiful pregnancy. She was going to fill her blog with pictures that appealed to the most vulnerable and suggestible audience: pregnant and nursing mums, and naive girls dreaming of a beautiful fairy tale of marriage and a baby. Although Katie didn't care whether she had a son or daughter, she thought it would be the most successful business project. and the care of children could always be shifted to nannies. Brandon adored children, so the bride's talk about their future child was taken with enthusiasm. He believed that children were proof of love. The groom couldn't imagine that, for his beloved, they were part of a business plan. Soon the wedding day arrived. Katie prepared for the event carefully, wishing that everything would be perfect. She wanted every step during the ceremony and the celebration to be captured on camera. She promised her subscribers, with tears in her eyes, that she would share every second of the happy event with them. But no matter how Katie planned the celebration, everything didn't go according to her perfect plan. The girl had been standing at the starting position for half an hour, waiting to go to the flower arch under beautiful music. But the groom and his best man, Emmanuel, didn't come to the wedding, and they didn't answer their phones. Maybe something happened to them, Zoe asked with concern as she looked at her phone's clock for the 100th time. I hope they were in an accident and are now in intensive care, Katie hissed angrily, clutching her bouquet of flowers, because that's the only excuse they have for being late. Zoe gasped, looking in horror at the bride's face. Katie, you shouldn't say that. Brandon is wonderful. He would never act like that without a reason. Katie only shook her head and clenched her teeth, almost turning her expensive veneers into crumbs. Did you even see what my followers are writing? She exclaimed. They're saying he dumped me. He ran away. Haters have immediately rushed and remembered all my past sins. My hanging in clubs, dancing on the pole, and over-drinking tequila. They say he came to his senses and did the right thing. Can you believe it? Brandon has a reputation as a knight in shining armour. He came from a poor family with brothers and sisters, raised himself and helped his family. And me? I'm still being judged for my past. They even found that video somewhere, even though I deleted it thanks to my dad's lawyers. They say the internet remembers everything. I've built my image of a princess brick by brick, Zoe. And if Brandon ruins everything, there will be no wedding. The girl defiantly threw a bouquet of peonies on the floor. Zoe groaned and awkwardly squatted in her long dress to pick up the flowers. At that moment, the groom and his best man burst onto the platform near the lake, where the celebration was to take place. They were breathing heavily, as if they had run here. But it wasn't even this that caught the guests' eyes, but their horrible, dirty appearance. Especially Brandon's. His suit, which Katie had meticulously chosen to match her dress and look good in the shot, was wet, dirty and covered in green slime, sand and mud. He had lost his jacket somewhere, leaving him in a wet shirt that clung to his body. There was nothing to say about the beautiful style of his hair, wet dark strands hanging down over his forehead and temples. And moreover, the man smelled like he had bathed in a sewer. Don't panic, we are already in place, the best man, Emmanuel, shouted cheerfully, spreading his arms apart and trying to catch his breath. The groom, as a real hero, had to go through fire and water before getting here, or rather only water, but here he is, ready to say his yes and kiss the bride. The guests, who were initially shocked by Brandon's appearance, started laughing. They did not understand what had happened to the groom or through what swamp he had swum to the wedding. However, Emmanuel was able to defuse the situation. Unfortunately, his jokes did not work on the bride. In front of Katie's eyes, a red veil descended. Her heart began to pound rapidly, her pulse echoing in her temples. She rushed down the aisle, straight toward the groom. Brandon, who had just been smiling and trying in vain to fix his hair with his fist, froze when he saw the bride. He immediately noticed the look on Katie's face as she rushed toward him. Loving women don't throw themselves into the arms of their loved ones with that look. It's the look they use when they want to strangle someone. You think I'm going to kiss you? Seriously? She shrieked in anger, forgetting her holy image and the witnesses to the scene. It's better to kiss a toad. At least it doesn't stink so much. You look like a bum. Do you think I dreamed of a wedding like this? A wedding where the groom is late and then shows up looking like a ragamuffin? Katie, what are you doing? A puzzled Brandon blinked. "I just didn't have time to change my clothes, but who cares? The main thing is that I'm here." "The main thing?" Katie was furious. "It would be better if you didn't appear at all than in this form. You embarrassed me, disgraced me in front of my guests and in front of my family. I'll be laughed at all over the internet. You ruined the best day of my life. So there's not going to be a wedding. Do you understand?" "Katie." Trying to calm the bride down, the groom attempted to soothe her. "Katie." Trying to calm the bride down, the groom attempted to soothe her. "Calm down, I'll explain everything." "Leave your explanations to yourself. I do not need them for nothing." The bride wailed hysterically. She sharply raised her hand and gave the groom a ringing slap. Then the girl looked at her palm with disgust. She wiped it on her snow-white dress and, turning abruptly, picked up her skirt and rushed away. Katie's emotional performance at her wedding quickly leaked to the internet. However, the girl had only become more popular. While many condemned her behaviour, her number of subscribers grew by the hour. Katie, who managed to escape to the resort after the thwarted wedding, no longer worried about the fact that she had acted badly. She would make up with Brandon, maybe. Well, of course, if he crawls on his knees. Meanwhile, her popularity was on the rise, which made her incredibly happy. She realised that black PR was also PR, and it was very effective. So, the girl enjoyed the white sand, sun and sea. But that was until Zoe called, "Hey, runaway bride, have you seen the news about Brandon? Or is there no TV on your island?" Katie blinked in surprise. "What news? I hope he didn't kill himself there out of grief." "In fact, Brandon has become a local treasure and idol to thousands of people," Zoe reported. "Journalists go to him like pilgrims. And, by the way, they sign contracts with his company. One businessman from Japan made the comment that he was constantly looking for a partner with high morals and family values." So, Brandon's company went international. Katie, you missed out on a great catch. Katie frowned and jumped up from her chaise longue. The icy cocktail spilled on her belly due to the sharp movement, forcing her to hiss. "Wait, what are you talking about?" "You can go to the internet and read it yourself," Zoe advised, not wanting to be the messenger that would receive the bad news. Katie did just that and quickly found the latest news about her ex-fiancé. That's how she found out why he was late for the wedding and looked so unkempt. It turned out that Brandon and Emmanuel were on their way to the wedding at the appointed time. Their route led along the river that flowed out of the lake. The car stopped at a traffic light, and Brandon was lost in thought, looking out of the window. His gaze caught the figure of some boys playing ball by the river. The river was narrow with slimy banks, and there were rumours that local businesses were dumping some kind of waste into it. The authorities turned a blind eye to it, probably because the stacks of bills were obstructing their vision. The traffic light changed to green and the car slowly moved off. At that moment, Brandon jerked and shouted, "Stop! Stop!" The driver frantically applied the brakes. Fortunately, the driver from behind also managed to slow down, but hit the signal, cursing the driver in front. "What are you doing, Brandon?" asked a dazed Emmanuel. The driver also looked at the groom with consternation. However, Brandon did not pay attention to them. He opened the car door and hurried out of the cabin. He ran headlong toward the river, where a tragedy was unfolding. One of the boys who had gone into the river to retrieve a ball that had fallen into it was already floundering in the water. The child tried to call for help, but immediately swallowed the water. The second child was numb with terror. Brandon only had time to throw off his shoes before he rushed into the river. The boy had already gone under. The river was deep and the water was murky. Brandon tried to find the boy at the bottom of the river, which he did not do immediately. When Brandon surfaced, his hands were trembling with tension and fear for the child. Emmanuel had already run up to the river and stepped into the muddy water. "Come on, give him here," he shouted to his friend, holding out his hands. The two of them pulled the child out, and passers-by from other cars, who became more and more involved, helped Brandon get out. He fell to his knees in front of the boy, put his ear to the child's chest, and realized with horror that he was not breathing. He began to apply pressure to the boy's chest, pumping water from his lungs. Then he began to perform CPR, with people crowded around him. Some cried, some called an ambulance, and others filmed what was happening. Brandon did not see them. He wanted to save the child. Fortunately, a miracle happened. The boy began to spit up water. Coming to his senses, he began to breathe convulsively, and then he began to sob. His friend cried too. Brandon sat down on the ground, breathing heavily. He began to shake and took out his cell phone, but it had fallen into disrepair after encountering the water. Emmanuel's phone fell into the water when he was helping his friend. The man waited for the ambulance, and the paramedics insisted on examining him. Only after that was Brandon able to go to his wedding. But to his great upset, his bride did not listen to his explanations. Unfortunately for Katie, who only enjoyed popularity for a couple of days, journalists publicized Brandon's feat. They told the whole world about his deed, making the man a grateful knight in the eyes of the people. Everyone laughed at his former fiancée, claiming that such a woman was not a match for such a noble man. If the main thing for her is appearance and not the soul, then let her marry a mannequin, chuckled the commentators. Let our princess go to the Wizard of Oz and ask for a heart, advised others. A wave of negativity descended on Katie. She tried to justify herself and even begged Brandon for forgiveness, wanting to regain the favour of the people. However, the man's eyes finally opened. He forgave her. He did not want to hurt her, but he did not want a relationship either. So, the glow of Katie's star faded, and the star fell from heaven to earth. By the way, Brandon did not brag about his popularity. He believed that he had not accomplished a feat, but had done what any man in his place should have done. Later, the mother and older sister of the rescued child came to him with gratitude. The boy's sister had no followers. She was not a model, but her heart was pure. Brandon was not immediately able to start a new relationship, and it happened later. First, Rachel became his friend, then his fiancée, then his faithful wife. What happened to Katie? Brandon didn't know. He didn't follow bloggers. He preferred a real life. A chicken sandwich, cheese, caviar sandwiches, coffee, and champagne. Would you like anything? Debbie walked around the first-class cabin of the huge airplane where she worked as a flight attendant with a charming smile. Debbie was an experienced employee that could tell at a glance whether her passengers needed anything. She didn't even need to look at her watch to know when it was time to serve the guests on the flight. "Darling, some champagne, please," said the elderly, slightly plump man in a business suit who was flying to London for some business. He sat by the window and was reading the latest newspaper when Debbie was walking down the aisle, pushing a trolley loaded with snacks and dishes. "Of course, just a moment," said the woman with a smile. Then she deftly pulled out a bottle of champagne from the lower compartment of the trolley, took it to the service area, opened it quickly, and poured the bubbly golden liquid into a crystal glass, which she then brought to the businessman. "Thank you, Debbie," said the man, and he went back to reading. Debbie truly loved her job. She had been serving on board an airline for 4 years now and had never regretted her choice. The boundless sky, the beautiful uniform, the opportunity to see other countries, and the diversity of time zones. All of this allowed her to feel free and distract her soul from various current problems, worries and anxieties, of which Debbie unfortunately had plenty. After finishing serving the dishes, Debbie returned to her workstation. She placed the trolley and looked at herself in the mirror. adjusting a few strands of hair that had come loose from her hairstyle. Debbie was a very attractive 28-year-old leggy beauty with shiny chestnut hair and dark green eyes, like lush summer grass. Her smile made men tremble with delight and women sigh with envy. However, there was something about her appearance that caused deep insecurities for the young flight attendant. Debbie sighed and looked at her left hand, where the middle finger was about 1 centimetre shorter than the neighbouring fingers. The girl intentionally painted her nails with the most neutral, calm-coloured polish and never had a manicure done at a salon, feeling embarrassed about this very noticeable physical flaw. For the same reason, Debbie hardly ever wore rings, not wanting to draw attention to her long, piano-like fingers. Against their background, this shorty, as the girl called it, looked terribly awkward. The only exception was the modest engagement ring, made of gold, that the flight attendant wore on the ring finger of her left hand. It was the only thing left to her as a memory of her late husband. Looking at the ring, Debbie involuntarily plunged back into her own memories. Andy died just over a year ago. Ironically, a week before his death, the spouse took out a loan at an incredibly high interest rate, and now Debbie had to pay off the debt alone. For the young flight attendant, the sum of the loan was simply unbearable, and each time she thought about it, hysteria and wild terror immediately seized her. All because the loan was not taken out from a bank, with which she could somehow try to negotiate, but from very dangerous people, representatives of the criminal layer of the city. Even now, more than a year later, Debbie couldn't give all the money to these terrible people, and they constantly called the woman, demanding the debt from her. Debbie still didn't understand what could have driven Andy to turn to these thugs for money, and most importantly, why did he need such a truly astronomical sum? In the last few months, the bandits had completely lost their minds, writing terrible threats on the walls near the flight attendant's house, or stalking her on the way from the airport to her home, following her taxi in their large, tinted black SUVs. It was clear that their main goal was to intimidate the young widow so much that she couldn't think of anything other than giving them this damned money. And it must be said, they were brilliantly successful in exerting this kind of influence. "Well, beauty, how much longer does my boss have to wait for his money?" asked the tall, broad-shouldered, and completely bald thug, once cornering the unfortunate flight attendant in an alley near her home. Debbie was returning from another flight and was barely able to understand what was happening. The man grabbed her by the arm and forcibly took her into a dark, abandoned building, where he and his accomplices began to threaten and intimidate her, demanding the money. "I gave you another 10,000 last week. I just don't have any more." Debbie tried to free herself from his stony grip. "I've explained to you 100 times already that I can't collect such large sums in such a small amount of time." The bandit only grinned crookedly. "The chief is too soft on you. He allowed you to pay back your debt in installments and for a whole year, but the time is ticking, and we're not even close to half the amount." "Even if I sell my apartment, it still won't be enough, and you understand that very well," Debbie pleaded, looking at the bulky man. The bouncer extended his huge index finger and slowly stroked Debbie's cheek, making her immediately nauseous. The sensation was unbearable, especially since the scoundrel's finger stank intolerably of thick tobacco. "You're beautiful," the bandit said in a low voice. "The chief asked to tell you that if you don't have the whole missing sum in your hands by our next meeting, he will allow you to return the debt in another, much more pleasant and easier way." The man smiled lecherously, and Debbie's heart immediately sank. No, he wouldn't dare, she said, looking at the scoundrel with unspeakable horror in her eyes. I'll report you to the police, and you'll all go to jail. Instead of answering, the scoundrel laughed loudly and struck Debbie in the stomach with such force that she felt like she had been blown out of her mind. Bent in half, she gasped for the cool autumn air, but oxygen stubbornly refused to penetrate her lungs, burning with pain. Don't try anything, growled the thug. If you say one word to the cops, we'll give you such an adventure that you'd wish you'd never been born. Do you understand me? The man grabbed Debbie by the chin and forced her to look into his small eyes, swollen with anger and hatred towards women. Got it, he shouted once more. Yes, the stewardess replied weakly, writhing in fear and pain in his arms. Tell me, how much time do I have? That's a different conversation, said the bandit, almost good-natured. He then set the girl on her feet as if she had weighed nothing at all and continued, You should have started solving the problem constructively. None of this would be happening to you right now. Debbie gave him a look of physical contempt from under her brow and leaned carefully against the wall of the house. Meanwhile, the man took out a small diary and marked a date with a pencil. Debbie stood holding her stomach and looked at the scoundrel, waiting in silence. You have 2 weeks, he finally said, and with a thud he closed the diary. If you don't collect the rest of the money in that time, get ready to meet my boss. And I assure you, you better be nice to him, or we'll sell you into slavery to the Turks. They love girls like you there. He smiled at Debbie with a predatory grin, like that of a jackal, before slowly getting into his black SUV and disappearing into the night. As soon as the car drove away, Debbie was seized by despair so intense that she was ready to tear out her hair. Sobbing hopelessly, she made her way up to her apartment, holding onto the railing to avoid falling. Debbie didn't know where she could get the rest of the money. She realized that even if she had asked her superiors to borrow it, it was unlikely that the airport would be able to meet her needs. Andy, how could you leave me like that? Debbie cried, looking at the photo of her late husband in a funeral frame. Where can I get money now? God, I can't even imagine what they might do to me. Andy Heslin was a businessman who made a decent income from various entrepreneurial activities, ranging from trading products at the city market to running a network of production for the manufacture of doors. Andy was ready to spend 24 hours a day at his company, seeking to control every process. But unfortunately, he invested a lot of money and time in his companies, but he was wrong about people every time. And recently, cunning managers managed to somehow steal from the businessman's company. The business suffered inevitable losses, and Andy literally had to start all over again. When most of the money ran out, Andy risked taking out a huge loan to correct his business mistakes. Banks no longer trusted Debbie's husband, unlike the criminal leader, who willingly agreed to lend money to Andy. The naive businessman believed that he could inject enough funds into each of his companies to revive them and start making profits. And from that profit, Andy planned to pay back the debt. But fate decided otherwise. The most amazing thing was that despite her husband's business failures, Debbie still loved him with all her heart. Andy was smart, gentle, kind. In short, the most perfect man in the world. And Debbie mourned him terribly. Even now, after so much time had passed, she couldn't fully believe that he was no longer by her side, and that his car would never stop again by their home. Debbie was upset by the fact that they hadn't been able to have children during their 2-year marriage. If she had a son or daughter from Andy, then perhaps she would have coped with all this much easier. No, I'm wrong though. The flight attendant shook her head to herself. Given the history of this debt, Who knows what danger the child could have been exposed to? Perhaps it was better that I didn't have time to give birth. Remembering how her husband had died a terrible death, Debbie shook her head sadly every time. God forbid anyone, even enemies, to have such a terrible end to their lives. Andy went to a country guest house for the weekend. He told his wife that he wanted to be alone for a while, to think about his life, about how to better manage the money he received from creditors. Debbie offered her husband to go with him. However, Andy politely refused. Don't worry, Debbie. Just think, what would you do there? You just got back from a flight. You need to rest. And I'll fry kebabs and make strong tea. I will be watching the mountains and thinking about how to save my business. A worried shadow flickered across Debbie's face. She felt that it would be better for him not to go anywhere alone. Andy, I'm scared. Debbie honestly admitted it to him. These people, and especially Mr. Connor, are real criminals. Maybe he's watching you. Andy just smiled softly. Debbie, my dear, you've read too many books. Mr. Connor is just an ordinary businessman, like me or any other person who runs several large companies at once. Yes, he has some connections with the criminal world in the past, but that was a long time ago. Now his reputation is practically crystal clear. Debbie looked at her husband with doubt. That's it. The key word here is practically. Who knows if he can be trusted? You talk about him as if he's the kindest person, but that's far from the truth. How many bad things did he do in the past? Andy turned away from his wife irritably. Don't start, please. If you believe anything they say in the news, you'll soon develop paranoia. Besides, Mr. Connor is only a witness in those cases. Come on, Debbie. Let's not discuss the past of my business partner and creditor, okay? Debbie pouted but quietly said, As you wish, Andy. But I just want my husband to live many happy years with me. But you're getting involved in some unpleasant story. The spouses quarrelled that evening because of that unfortunate loan, because Debbie didn't want to let him go alone out of town. However, Andy was always stubborn by nature, so he didn't listen to his wife, packed his sports bag, and left for their country house the next morning. Debbie was very nervous all day, and as it turned out, not in vain. Closer to the evening, Andy stopped answering completely. She felt that something terrible had happened. However, she continued to wait and believe until the end that it was all just her own imagination. Debbie only realized that her intuition had not failed her when her husband did not return home the next morning. Andy's phone was off, and an unpleasant shiver ran down her spine. God, please let him be alive. As soon as the young woman thought that, her phone vibrated, announcing an incoming call. The number was unknown, so Debbie's heart immediately sank. Hello? She answered, her voice trembling with excitement. Mrs. Heslin? Asked a male voice. This is Captain Perez. I have sad news for you. Your husband, Andy Heslin, died last night as a result of a fire that broke out in your country house. Debbie's legs buckled, and if it weren't for the sofa next to her, she would have fallen to the floor. Debbie pressed her hand to her lips, trying to stifle a groan. How? She managed to whisper. The experts have determined that it was an accident, the policeman explained. Apparently, your husband didn't pay attention to the container with the ignition fluid, and it exploded. What? No, it can't be, protested Debbie. My husband was always extremely careful and cautious. He would never leave the liquid near the fire. The captain grunted slightly irritably before answering. Mrs. Heslin, I am only saying what has been confirmed. Facts are facts and you can't argue with them. Your husband was grilling kebabs on a barbecue, and the barbecue was in the garage under the roof. Apparently, a spark from the coals hit the container of fluid, and then the fire spread throughout the house. So, our house burned down too? The young woman asked incredulously. The policeman sighed loudly and answered in the affirmative. Your cottage is surrounded by a forest on 3 sides. This created the most, favourable conditions for spreading a fire. The fire spread from the garage to the interior of the house, and everything burned down to the ground. I'm sorry. I understand that it's difficult for you to accept the fact of your husband's death and the complete destruction of your country house, but what happened was just a series of unfortunate circumstances. I wanted to go with him, Debbie sobbed into the phone. I wanted to be there with him. Please calm down, the captain said softly. If you had been there with your husband, you would have died just the same. There would have been no chance for both of you to survive. I understand that this is a weak consolation for you right now, but at least you are still alive. After that conversation, Debbie couldn't close her eyes and spent the whole night staring at the ceiling. She didn't want to believe that Andy was gone. This death, so terrible and absurd, seemed very strange to Debbie. The carelessness that the policeman spoke of was completely uncharacteristic of her husband, and ultimately, Debbie began to suspect that Andy had been killed precisely because of the money borrowed from Mr. Connor. The funeral of her husband was very modest, as there was nothing left of Andy, and they had to bury an empty coffin in the ground. Debbie couldn't sleep for almost a month, repeatedly returning to thoughts of her husband's death. The only thing that helped her distract from all this was her work. And Debbie continued to fly one flight after another, hardly noticing how the dates on the calendar passed by quickly. And then the threatening calls started, and the woman found out that she would now have to pay off the loan for her deceased husband. At first, Debbie thought that she would give them the bag of money that Andy brought from them on the day of the loan. However, after searching the entire apartment and checking all the accounts, Debbie came to a terrible conclusion. The money was nowhere to be found. That's when she remembered that her husband had gone to the country house with that same bag. So, the woman thought to herself, probably Andy wanted to hide the money at our summer house, and they probably burned in that monstrous fire. Debbie felt her soul freeze with fear. She couldn't imagine how she would be able to pay such a huge sum to the gangsters. Risking her own life, she asked to meet with Mr. Connor. When she was brought to his mansion, Debbie thought she wouldn't come out alive. However, the man, seeing the beautiful wife of his deceased borrower, immediately softened his anger and gave Debbie a deferment for a year. The deadline was approaching, and the poor woman had not been able to pay even half of her debt. She started working almost every weekend, hoping to earn as much money as possible before Mr. Connor's henchmen came after her again. Debbie grew up in a village. Her parents were simple but honest people who loved each other. Her father worked as a forester. Despite his solid age, the man was still full of energy and could easily take long walks in the forest. Her mother worked in the village post office, delivering letters and newspapers to all the residents of the old settlement. As long as Debbie could remember, there had always been love and understanding in their home, and her parents raised her solely by their own example, trying to be a kind of role model for their daughter. The girl never heard a rude or mean word addressed to her, but always found support and good advice when she needed it. After finishing school, Debbie realized that there were no prospects for her in her village. She wanted to study foreign languages, but there were no opportunities to use them in such a remote place. Besides, Debbie had a dream that she initially feared telling even her parents. Since childhood, Debbie had been fascinated by the sky. She could spend hours admiring the airplanes' traces in the sky, wondering what was inside them. The flying machines looked small from below and huge when seen up close. The girl's parents had never flown on airplanes, and Debbie had never been even to the sea. That's why her passion for travel, coupled with the opportunity to rise above the ground and clouds, gave birth to her passionate dream of becoming a stewardess. Nevertheless, her father and mother understood that their daughter needed an education and allowed her to go to the city with a calm heart. Debbie thought that studying languages was a priority for her currently, and then, as soon as she settled down in the capital, she would think about a career as a flight attendant. After graduating, Debbie became a certified translator in 2 languages, Chinese and Spanish. This opened the doors to a world of high-paying work for her. The first time, the girl worked as a secretary referent with translation functions in a very prestigious media company. Debbie rented a beautiful apartment in the city and felt absolutely great, but she still sometimes dreamed of the sky and a stewardess uniform at night. After working for that company for about 2 years, she realized that she could no longer ignore her dream. It was then that Debbie finally decided to try to enroll in stewardess courses. The girl studied diligently and crammed the necessary material for days, ignoring parties and walks with friends. But the result of her efforts was accurately what she wanted. Debbie passed the final exam and got the opportunity to get her dream job. Fortunately, she always had good health, and her incredibly attractive appearance allowed her to easily pass the unofficial face control, which was an integral part of getting this job. On her first flight, Debbie felt an incomparable delight. Her feelings overwhelmed her, and unable to withstand their pressure, she even quietly burst into tears when no one was looking. Her oldest secret dream had come true. And for the first time since graduation from the institute, Debbie felt at home. On one of the flights, the girl met Andy. The young man was 3 years older than her and was flying to another city for a business deal. They both felt that they liked each other. However, decency made them wait until the end of the flight. Only then did Andy approach the young, beautiful stewardess and invite her to dinner at a restaurant. "Please, don't refuse." Andy looked at her with a silent plea in his eyes. "I know it may seem strange to you, but as soon as I saw you, I knew. I just had to try to get to know you." Andy's embarrassed smile accompanied his words. Debbie was overwhelmed with incredible emotions at that moment. She could not have imagined that she would be fortunate enough to meet someone whose soul would be like the other half of her own. Andy understood the girl so well that sometimes it seemed to Debbie that everything was happening to her was a fairy tale. Standing in front of the mirror in the flight attendant service room, Debbie thought that life with Andy was the happiest period in her life. She was unlikely to ever meet a person with such spiritual qualities again. Her husband was not just a partner with whom she agreed to spend the rest of her life. He was her friend, the most passionate lover, and a like-minded person, always ready to support her in difficult times. Their last separation was all the more terrible because of a silly argument made the loving spouses spend the night apart before their trip to the summer house. Debbie was about to sit down in her seat in the aisle when suddenly the plane began to shake mercilessly. The light in the cabin flickered, and loud voices of passengers full of dissatisfaction and fear were immediately heard. "Oh my God, we are falling!" cried a woman. "What's happening? Stewardess, where's the stewardess?" A middle-aged male voice was heard. "Mummy, I'm scared. Are we going to die?" A child's voice wailed somewhere very close to Debbie. Debbie immediately understood that they had entered a zone of turbulence. This had happened to her many times before, but still, every time, Debbie was a little scared. However, she had no right to show her feelings to the passengers, as it would be a complete violation of all the rules of conduct for personnel on board. Taking a few deep breaths, the woman moved into the cabin and tried to maintain an expression of complete composure on her face. Debbie beamed a dazzling smile at everyone she passed by, asking them to fasten their seatbelts and remain calm. "Why are we shaking like this?" protested the same businessman who had recently ordered champagne from her. "Are you telling us the truth, or are you just trying to drag it out until we find out We only have 100 meters left to fly to the ground." "Don't worry, it sometimes happens during the flight." Debbie tried to calm him down. "The turbulence zone will end soon, and we will continue our journey. There is absolutely no reason to worry." The businessman muttered something in response, but still securely fastened his seatbelt. A little further, Debbie noticed a beautiful lady of about 50. The woman was dressed in an expensive coral suit and held a luxurious cream-coloured leather bag on her knees. Debbie immediately realised that the woman was wealthy. Her manicure, hairstyle and beautiful shoes from the latest collection of a famous fashion house spoke for themselves. However, no matter how much money she had, the woman was, first of all, a passenger, and like all passengers on this flight, was experiencing genuine fear at the moment. Currently, when the stewardess reached her seat, the plane shook violently again. The lady screamed loudly and dropped her bag on the floor. Debbie instinctively bent down, easily picking up the graceful accessory, after which she handed it to the passenger, still maintaining a polite smile on her face. "Thank you," the lady said with pale lips, and then her gaze fell on the flight attendant's left hand, which she held the bag with. The woman instantly turned as white as a sheet, and with a dumb question looked at Debbie. She immediately recognized this finger, the only one shorter than all the others. "Debbie?" the passenger whispered in shock. Matilda Williams, that was the name of this wealthy woman, suddenly felt as if her entire body had been struck by an electric current. Everything seemed to darken before her eyes for a few seconds, and the lady, out of fear, decided that it was only a matter of time before she fainted. "Yes, I understand that you are scared, but everything will end very soon, I promise," Debbie reassured her. "We just need to endure a little longer." After that, smiling at Matilda, the flight attendant calmly walked further into the cabin. As soon as she disappeared, the lady grabbed her heart. "Oh God, it can't be! She's alive and flying on the same plane with me," Matilda thought. "Is it really her? Who else could have such a specific middle finger?" The woman eagerly awaited the moment when the airplane would pass through the turbulence zone and everyone would finally calm down. Crossing herself, Matilda got up from her seat and headed straight to the corridor where the flight attendants were sitting. Debbie was discussing something with her colleague when she caught the wealthy passenger's surprised gaze. "Are you feeling better?" Debbie politely asked, looking at the woman with genuine concern and sympathy. "Yes, thank you," the woman replied slowly, as she nervously dug her nails into her small purse. "I'm sorry, maybe it's not the right time to do this, but I really need to talk to you. Could you please spare me a couple of minutes?" Debbie looked embarrassed and glanced at the other flight attendant before nodding. "Okay, please have a seat." Debbie's colleague immediately got up from her seat and went to the cabin to check if the other passengers needed anything. Matilda sat on the edge of the seat and continued to twirl her purse in her hands for a few seconds. The woman simply didn't know where to start. She was about to tell this young woman something that might seem like complete nonsense to others, but she couldn't afford to miss such a chance. Who knows? Maybe she wasn't wrong. "You see," Matilda began, blushing heavily, "it just so happened that I noticed a certain peculiarity on your hand. Your finger." It was Debbie's turn to blush with embarrassment. The young woman instinctively clenched her left hand into a fist so that the shortened phalanx wouldn't be visible. "Yes, I understand. It must have been unpleasant for you to see that, but I was born with it and I can't do anything about it," she explained. The woman shook her head with feeling. No, please don't think that way. I had no intention of offending or belittling you in any way. Not at all." Debbie looked at her somewhat bewildered. "Then what is it that has upset you so much?" Matilda took a deep breath and then decided to tell her. "You see, many years ago I lost my daughter. She was only 3 years old at the time. My husband, her stepfather, was driving her to another city, and they got into an accident. My husband couldn't control the car, and it went off the road. When Oliver came to his senses, the child was nowhere to be found. He, being injured, searched the surrounding areas but never found her. She just disappeared without a trace. Even now, 25 years later, memories of her lost child caused Matilda almost physical pain. The deep maternal wound in her heart never healed, and every word spoken aloud about her daughter was like a cutting knife for the woman. The lady wiped her tearful eyes with a handkerchief, but Debbie's face showed only sympathy and confusion. "I really sympathize with you," Debbie sincerely said, "but forgive me for being rude. I really don't understand how I can help you." Matilda smiled weakly. "Your name is Debbie, right? Debbie?" "That's right," the flight attendant nodded. "Debbie Heslin, formerly Yahtzee. But how does that relate to your story?" Suddenly the wealthy woman extended her hand to Debbie and affectionately patted her on the shoulder. "My little girl's name was Debbie too, and she had the same peculiarities as you. It runs in our family, going back to my grandfather. One of his fingers was shorter than the others, and then it was passed down to my daughter through the generations." Matilda looked at Debbie, crying and smiling at the same time through her tears. When it dawned on the flight attendant what she meant, it was as if the world around the young woman had wobbled, and the turbulence was no longer relevant. "Are you saying that you think I could be your daughter, lost over 20 years ago?" The wealthy woman slowly nodded her head and said, "I don't just think so, I'm sure of it. Everything fits. Your name, your age. Debbie, how happy I am to have found you and to know that you're alive." In a burst of emotion, Matilda couldn't help but try to hug Debbie. However, the flight attendant gently stopped her movement. To say that Debbie was stunned by what she had heard would be an understatement. "I'm sorry, but don't you think it could just be a coincidence?" Debbie looked at Matilda with doubt. "The tragic disappearance of your daughter is undoubtedly a great sorrow, and I understand why you seized on my peculiarity, but I already have parents, and thank God they are alive and love me, and I love them too." The woman looked at her with sadness but still stood her ground. "My dear, I don't know how this could have happened. Maybe you should ask your own parents about it. However, I still believe that you are my Debbie, my lost little daughter. I really beg you to meet with me later and do a DNA test." Debbie sat there unable to speak. She didn't know how to react to everything she had heard. In the end, she had to take a few sips of water to manage her emotions. After thinking for a while, she agreed to meet with Matilda again and took her business card. After landing at the airport, Debbie immediately took a taxi and went to the nearest bus station, where she bought bus tickets to her native village. If this woman is telling the truth, does that mean that my mum and dad have been hiding the secret of my past from me all these years? But why would they need to do that? Did I have a childhood full of lies? All these questions were swirling in the young woman's head. However, she was determined to find out the truth, and so she eagerly awaited the bus to take her to her family home. Her parents were pleasantly surprised to see their beloved daughter at the doorstep. "Debbie, my soul," the happy mother chirped around the stewardess. "You could have at least warned us that you were coming. I would have baked your favourite raspberry pie." "You've been away for too long," her father said with slight reproach. "You don't take care of yourself on these flights. Do they even feed you there? You've lost a lot of weight, dear." The man took his daughter's suitcase and carried it into their beautiful log house, which the forester built many years ago, using ancient technology without a single nail. He was very proud of that. Soon the whole family settled in the kitchen to drink tea. The young woman was very nervous and, for the first time, did not know how to ask her parents about what was currently bothering her the most. "Mum, Dad," slowly began Debbie, "first of all, I want to tell you that I love you very much." "We love you too, daughter," the father replied, "and we always will, no matter what happens. But you didn't come here for that, did you?" "You always see the essence of things right away, Dad," Debbie said thoughtfully, and then asked directly, "Tell me, are you my natural parents?" Debbie looked at her parents intently, shifting her gaze from one to the other. There was nowhere else to back down. A light shadow passed over the mother's face, and her smile slowly began to fade. "Why on earth are you asking such questions, Debbie?" the woman asked with concern. "Of course we are your parents. Who else?" At that moment, the man covered his wife's hand with his own and then said in a low voice, "Debbie, I had hoped that you would never ask such a question. But apparently, it cannot be that the truth will not come to light sooner or later." The man shook his head helplessly and silenced any objections from his wife with his gaze. After that, he poured himself a new cup of tea and took a big sip. "That was a long time ago," he began, looking into the distance. "We went through a great sorrow then." The man paused for a moment, but Debbie's mother continued for him. "I already had a miscarriage 3 times. I couldn't carry a baby, and the doctors said that if I tried again, then I wouldn't survive. I could die from bleeding and complications." Debbie's mother sobbed and wiped her eyes with the edge of her scarf. She really didn't want to remember that difficult period in her life. "I used to go into the woods all the time back then, trying to calm my grief and dull the pain," the father continued. "And one day, when I was walking past the walnut grove, I saw you sitting on the edge there, crying with burning tears. That's why we called you Squirrel, because you were sitting there under the walnut tree with your fluffy red braids and rubbing your face with your hands like a sad little squirrel." Remembering this, Debbie's father smiled slightly, but it was clear that he was experiencing forceful emotions as he spoke. And although not a single muscle twitched on his face, the father's shoulders trembled with soundless sobs that he was trying to suppress with all his might. "You were only 3 years old then," the mother explained. "Your father picked you up in a bundle and brought you to our home." The woman smiled sadly, looking at her daughter with tenderness. "I remember thinking back then that the Lord had finally taken pity on me and sent you to me. You were so weak, with a huge scratch on your forehead, and you kept calling for your mum, and you cried endlessly." Inside Debbie, everything seemed to turn upside down. So that woman on the plane could really be her mother. The very thought of it did not settle in her mind. "But how did you manage to hide my appearance from everyone? You and Dad basically kidnapped me, Mum," Debbie protested, although tears of regret and understanding were already glistening in her eyes. Her mother shook her head and squeezed her husband's hand a little tighter. "We didn't kidnap you. We found you. Those are entirely different things." A mother's jealousy flared up in the woman's eyes. "You were left in the woods and you were wounded. That woman was a cuckoo, not a real mother." The father patted his wife's shoulder, trying to calm her down, while his daughter spoke up. "We gave all our family golden savings to our then chairman so that he would help us to get documents for you. That's how you became our daughter." Debbie sat before her parents, looking at them with sadness and love at the same time. She understood perfectly well what had driven them to such a desperate step, but it didn't make it any easier. "And how did you find out that we had adopted you?" the father asked, squinting. "We didn't tell anyone about it and hoped that this secret would die with us." Debbie looked at her parents and realized that they really knew nothing about her biological mother. She told her parents about the wealthy lady, showing them her business card. The father carefully examined the card and then calmly said, "Daughter, if you think it's the right thing to do, you can meet this woman. We have no right to stop you. You are an adult, independent person now. But if you suddenly become disillusioned after finding out the truth, know that your mother and I will always be there for you, and nothing will change for us. It doesn't matter whether we share the same blood or not. We will always be your parents." In gratitude, Debbie hugged her mother and father tightly. "Thank you," she whispered. "I have the best parents in the world." After staying with her parents for a couple more days, Debbie returned to the city. She wanted to meet Matilda and ask one of her colleagues to replace her on the flight. When Matilda learned that Debbie was willing to take the DNA test, she was overjoyed. A few days later, the test results arrived, and, to Debbie's huge surprise, her new acquaintance was right. She really was her biological mother. Learning this, the rich woman immediately invited Debbie to her house. When the luxurious car brought Debbie to Matilda's estate, the young woman could not contain her admiration. She had never in her life seen such luxury and style that literally squeezed into every piece of furniture and magnificent green garden of a mansion. She was led into the living room, where her biological mother greeted her. Matilda looked very excited, but charming. She was wearing a long silk jacket without sleeves and a spacious linen blouse, which, combined with matching trousers and a light blush on her cheeks, made the lady look visibly 10 years younger. Debbie was once again amazed by her elusive sense of taste in clothing. "Debbie, I'm so glad you came, dear," the woman exclaimed, throwing her hands up. "Oh my God, I can't believe I finally found you after so many years." Matilda hugged her, and Debbie felt it would be wrong to reject this heartfelt embrace. It wasn't that Debbie was uncomfortable with the display of parental affection from Matilda. In fact, she still couldn't get used to the idea that it was this woman, not her mother from the village, who gave her life. "Let me introduce you to someone," said Matilda, as she led her daughter into a cosy little room where a presentable-looking man in a business suit sat in a wide leather chair. Upon seeing Debbie, he immediately stood up and extended his hand in greeting. "I'm Oliver," the businessman introduced himself, and he cautiously shook the guest's hand. "You probably don't remember me, Debbie." Debbie shook her head and looked at her mother questioningly. "This is your father, Debbie," Matilda said, almost crying with happiness. "Oh," was all Debbie could say. She scrutinized Oliver's features but saw no resemblance to herself. Then, when they went to the dining room to have tea, Oliver behaved strangely. He was nervous and smiled widely, but his smile was insincere. "If you only knew how scared I was then, what I went through when I woke up and saw that you weren't around," her father told her. "I woke up and the car was already on fire. I got out of the car, but with great difficulty. My leg was badly hurt. I thought maybe you had hidden somewhere near the road because you were scared. But as soon as I moved a few meters away from the car, it exploded." The man spoke very emotionally, but kept looking at his newly found daughter as if he wasn't happy about her return at all. Of course, Debbie had no idea that Oliver wasn't her biological father. He married her mother when she was already 3 months pregnant with her first husband, who died in an accident in a neighbouring city. Arthur Clark, Debbie's real biological father, had made a deal with very unreliable partners who eventually arranged his death at a large residential complex construction site. Oliver Williams, a longtime friend of the Clark family, had been supporting the grieving young widow for many months. In gratitude, Matilda began to invite him to her home more and more often, and eventually married him. In reality, Debbie's stepfather had hated her since childhood. He always felt that she was a possible competitor, as he wanted to take over his deceased friend's business completely over time, and now he was unpleasantly surprised when hated Debbie suddenly reappeared years later, like a ghost from the past, and tried to upset all his plans. The most unpleasant thing for the businessman was that his wife was seriously considering bringing her daughter into their business. After the first meeting, Matilda started to invite Debbie to her house more and more often, and Debbie was, of course, happy to learn more about her past and get to know her biological mother better. At the same time, the young woman did not perceive her father at all, as if she felt he was not her real father. Matilda never said anything to her daughter about it, hoping that Debbie and Oliver's misunderstanding would disappear over time. "Matilda dear, forgive me, but I don't understand why you're so fixated on the idea of Debbie becoming a full-fledged shareholder. After all, so much time has passed, and her profession is entirely different. She won't be able to become a decent business lady from a stewardess." "Excuse me for being so blunt," said Oliver. Matilda looked at her spouse with bewilderment. Debbie is a descendant of the Clarks. She was raised by entirely different people, rural people, but that didn't stop her from graduating from school and college with honours. She knows 2 foreign languages perfectly. I'm certain that once she learns a little more and delves deeper into our business, our genes will definitely take their course." Oliver was beside himself with rage. He was at a loss for words, but he was not going to leave it at that. He began to think about how to get rid of this old thorn in his side. The point was that he already had his own trusted people in his wife's company, with whom he had been quietly engaged in fraud and embezzlement for a long time. They laundered money through third-party projects and transferred it to their personal foreign accounts. Oliver planned to fully subordinate the entire board of directors to himself to control all the resources alone. However, for this to happen, he needed to make sure that Matilda would not suspect anything. With the appearance of Debbie in their lives, Oliver's plan risked falling apart, and he intended to do everything possible to ensure that his stepdaughter never touched the inner workings of her mother's company. Summoning one of his shadow operation assistants to his office, Oliver told him, "It's time to take decisive action. This little stewardess is already planning to do an internship with our company. I need you to finish what I couldn't do many years ago." Oliver looked closely at the assistant and he turned pale, realizing exactly what the boss wanted from him. Then Oliver continued, "I set up that accident when I almost crashed with my adopted daughter. I thought I'd get rid of her while she was still little, and all the problems would be solved. For so many years I hoped that she disappeared somewhere in the woods and would never be heard from again. And now she has appeared and wants to try her hand at her mother's business." The assistant, listening to Oliver, swallowed in fear. He never thought that he would be asked to commit the most terrible crime that could exist in a civilized society. It was already beyond the pale. "I can't allow her to ruin everything that I have been collecting bit by bit for so many years. After all, I even brought her father, Arthur, into contact with those companions to eliminate him and so that Matilda would not find out anything. And now I have to do the same thing with her daughter." Oliver looked pointedly at the man standing before him. "But don't worry, I've thought of everything in advance. The day after tomorrow, I'll schedule a meeting in the park. In the evening, I'll say I want to talk to her without witnesses and discuss some prospects in our company. And then, you understand perfectly well what you need to do. Just make sure everything looks like a simple robbery. I don't want to be the first to be suspected." The assistant, though not happy with such a terrible task, agreed. What else could he do? After all, he was a person under duress. Debbie agreed to meet her stepfather without any ulterior motives, not knowing what terrible fate he had in store for her. Late in the evening, when the deserted space of the park was illuminated only by the weak light of evening lanterns, Debbie stopped near the agreed-upon meeting place with the businessman. The young woman did not suspect that Oliver was not her biological father, so she did not sense the danger emanating from him. Anyway, she explained their disagreements about her possible work in her mother's company by saying that they had not seen each other much in recent years. Debbie waited at the meeting place for at least half an hour before deciding to call Oliver. To her surprise, the mechanical voice on the other end of the line told her that the subscriber was out of range. "Strange," she said aloud, and she was about to go home when someone grabbed her from behind and covered her mouth with their hand so that she couldn't make a sound. "Stand still, otherwise I'll cut you like a sheep." She heard a male voice behind her, which seemed very vague to Debbie, but was still familiar. However, When the robber turned the victim to face him, Debbie's horror knew no bounds. The criminal turned out to be her ex-husband, Andy. He also did not expect to see his former spouse at the ordered location, and therefore, for the first few seconds, simply stared at her in silence, losing the gift of speech due to surprise. Andy didn't even bother wearing a mask, so he was sure he could quietly get rid of his victim. "Andy, is it really you? Are you alive?" Debbie struggled to say it, looking at her ex-husband straight in the eye. "But how? You died in that fire. The investigator told me." "Debbie," Andy interrupted her, still holding the woman in his steel embrace. "Believe me, I'm very sorry it turned out this way. But I didn't have any other choice then. They would have killed me." "Who?" Debbie didn't understand anything. "Mr. Connor with his cronies." Andy shook her by the shoulders. "I overheard one of them discussing how they were going to bury me somewhere in the forest. About a couple of weeks after that damned loan was given to me. So I decided to run away with the money. I staged my own death in the fire. I had to cheat them. Sorry, but I didn't have another choice." Slowly, the meaning of her husband's words began to dawn on Debbie. "So what was your plan?" she asked. "You were going to abandon me, get away the money, and leave me to be torn apart by these scumbags. Is that what you planned?" Debbie began to resist with all her might, trying to free herself from Andy's grip while showering him with accusations. "How could you do this to me? I loved you so much and trusted you so much." Her ex-husband only held her tighter and closed his eyes tightly. Of course, he did not expect anything like this from his plan. When he faked his own death in the fire and disappeared with the gang's money, for a while he thought he had completely robbed Mr. Connor, and his gang didn't have any leverage over him, but he couldn't imagine that they would demand his wife pay back the debt. Having squandered all the money in a short period of time and being left with literally nothing, Andy somehow managed to make himself new documents and use them to get a job at Matilda's company. Oliver immediately realized that he had an employee with fake documents in his ranks, but decided not to fire him for the time being, perfectly understanding that he could use that against Andy. That's why, when it was time to get his hands dirty, the businessman chose Debbie's ex-husband. And Andy couldn't even think that the woman he had to eliminate was his ex-wife. Now more than ever, Andy understood that Debbie was the only witness to all his crimes, and he couldn't leave her alive. "Forgive me, Debbie." He tried to calm his wife, holding her tighter, while all the time raised a long, sharp blade in the dark with his free hand. "It's all going to end now," he said meaningfully, and he was about to plunge the blade into the woman's body. But at that moment, someone suddenly knocked the knife out of his hand with a strong movement, turning her hand 180 degrees. The villain screamed in pain, and Debbie managed to free herself from his choking grip finally. She watched in horror as a homeless man in ripped jeans and an old jacket tried to twist her ex-husband's arm. "Call the police, quickly," he shouted to Debbie, and she noticed that her saviour was not much older than Debbie. She didn't have to repeat it twice, so Debbie immediately dialed the short number, and a few minutes later the police arrived to arrest the scoundrel. The homeless guy gave his testimony. He had been sleeping on a bench nearby, June weather permitting, and then heard a woman screaming and immediately rushed to help, knowing that the park was not safe in the evenings. In the end, the police arrested Andy, and he confessed without any qualms during questioning that Debbie's stepfather had organized the entire assassination attempt. At that moment, a shocked Matilda learned about her daughter's loan and her husband's terrible intentions, and Debbie herself learned that Oliver was not her biological father. Then a special police operation was carried out, and Mr. Connor and all his gang were caught red-handed. After resolving all her problems, Debbie went back to the park to find and thank the homeless man who saved her life. However, she couldn't find him and went home disappointed. As she got out of the taxi, she noticed a young man with a huge bouquet of red roses standing near her entrance. "I wonder who got so lucky," Debbie thought to herself with a smile as she walked past him. Just as she was about to pass the young man, she realized she had seen him before. "Good afternoon." The recently homeless man, who was now dressed in a beautiful light grey business suit, smiled at her. "I apologize for showing up so unexpectedly, but I just had to see you again." Debbie stood there, looked at him in amazement, as a shy smile slowly appeared on her face. "Is it you? You're the very homeless man who saved me in the park, aren't you? Why are you here, and looking so amazing?" the guy joked. "Yeah," Debbie laughed sincerely. "That's exactly what I wanted to say." The man, whose name was Glenn, explained to her that he actually worked as a psychologist, solving the emotional problems of successful businessmen and showbiz stars. He was brought to the park by his professional needs. He had been writing his thesis on social inequality in modern society for a long time, and to test some of his theories in practice, he dressed up as a homeless person, hoping to evaluate people's reactions to him from different social strata. Where else but in a huge city park is the best place to conduct such experiments? The psychologist said, handing the young woman a fragrant bouquet. Debbie was flattered and happy at the same time. After all, the man who wasn't afraid to help her in a difficult, life-threatening moment turned out to be such an interesting and intelligent man. Glenn invited her on a date, and Debbie agreed with pleasure. The young people went to the opera and then talked for a long time, discussing what they had seen. Gradually, the conversation shifted from the theatre to other areas of life, and Debbie told Glenn about all the surprises that life had given her. "You're a wonderful woman, Debbie," Glenn said with a smile. "To go through so many truly shocking and tragic events and not break, not lose faith in goodness. And something truly high. You know, I would really like to meet you again, if you don't mind." Debbie agreed with a laugh. Of course she would be happy to see Glenn again. His tactfulness and attentiveness, as well as his perfect manners, left an indelible mark on her soul. Soon after that, Glenn and Debbie started dating. The young people were literally charmed by each other, and their feelings blossomed like a beautiful and delicate lily flower. After a few months, Glenn proposed to Debbie. The wedding was not the loudest, but it was definitely the most beautiful and memorable for all the guests and the newlyweds themselves. Debbie was happy that she now had two mothers. Matilda did not hold a grudge against Debbie's adoptive mother and father, as they had protected her daughter from possible harm for many years. A year later, Debbie gave birth to a beautiful daughter. Debbie stopped flying and focused on her family, while Glenn continued to work as a psychologist and later successfully defended his research, improving his qualifications and confirming his first-class professional level. Now Debbie and her family have many years of serene family happiness, security, and peace of mind ahead of them. Lavette Harris hurried home, a satisfied smile never leaving her lips. Upon entering her apartment, she removed her old scarf, went to the kitchen, and placed the rustling packages on the table. The woman hummed a silly song that she had heard somewhere on her way. It seemed to play in the supermarket where she went to get groceries. The song was extremely absurd, and the rhyme was even worse, and Lavette involuntarily thought that sometimes pop hits were worse than a cold. They infect you, penetrate your consciousness, and cannot be cured by aspirin. "Why are you so happy?" asked Vanessa, Lavette's eldest daughter, entering the kitchen. "Did you see tomatoes on sale? Or did you grab 2 pieces of cheese for the price of 1? The girl looked slyly at her mother, knowing her love for discounts. Vanessa took an apple from the package, wiped it on her sweater, and bit into it with a crunch. "Wash it first." Her mother shook her head, looking disapprovingly at her daughter. "And no, you didn't guess it. I went to school, discussed Sandy's studies with the class teacher, and also found a job. And all this in one go." The girl said, looking at her mother with a mischievous look. "And what job did you get, may I ask?" Our school needed a PE teacher, but you don't look like a fitness star. And did you not notice me doing jumping jacks with a skipping rope, Mummy? Lovette rolled her eyes. Yes, she was not a sports enthusiast. Cookies were more to her liking than squats. Unfortunately, nature took pity on the sweet tooth and allowed delicacies not to accumulate too much on her hips. Nessie, the mother shook her head. You know how to make compliments. Stop shortening my name, protested the daughter, her mouth full. Show some respect. It's enough that you named me after the Loch Ness Monster. Why didn't you name me Yeti, for example? The mother did not react to the grumbling of her daughter, continuing to send vegetables and dairy products to their places in the refrigerator. Vanessa had just turned 14. She was at that age when she didn't like absolutely everything. The teenager was dissatisfied with her school studies, picky teachers, the existence of her younger sister, who dragged her things, the impossibility of buying a new smartphone with a stump of an apple on the back panel, and even the colour of the sky. It was either too cloudy or too clear. The girl expressed her dissatisfaction violently. She cried into her pillow, slammed the door so hard that the whole apartment shook, and listened to music at full volume. Lovette treated the rebellious period with Buddhist calmness. She accepted her daughter with all her quirks and tried to support her when necessary. For example, when Vanessa stopped accepting her appearance and craved drastic changes, Lovette herself brought pink hair dye to the house. They had been laughing for a long time because they not only dyed strands of Vanessa's head, but also half of the bathtub. Lovette's childhood was not a rainbow, therefore she tried her best to make her daughter's childhood happy. However, there was not enough money. That's why the woman took a second job, which she could combine with her position as a nurse. I won't be a PE teacher, exclaimed Lovette. The school needs an additional cleaner to help out. They pay well, after all. Your school is not an ordinary one. Sandy's homeroom teacher told me about it. The mother also discussed the schedule, the promised amounts, and the fact that both of her daughters would be fed for free thanks to her employment. But Vanessa was no longer listening. The daughter stopped chewing the apple and could not swallow the piece remaining in her mouth. She looked at her mother in shock, not believing her ears. Vanessa hoped her mum was joking. Are you kidding? She asked as she struggled to swallow her apple. The unchewed piece of fruit lodged in her throat, making it hard to breathe. Snow White probably died like that, she thought to herself, feeling nauseous. What are you talking about? Mum blinked in surprise. You're joking, right? Vanessa raised her eyebrows. Are you getting back at me because I didn't call you a fitness model? Lovette looked carefully at her daughter. Then she sighed, put aside the yogurt pack, and sat down on a chair. Nessie, Mum started calmly. What's wrong again? Are you serious? Vanessa exploded. My mother will be a janitor at school. Seriously, Mum, do you want me to turn into a laughingstock? A pariah? What nonsense is in your head? Lovette frowned. It's not nonsense, it's reality. You yourself said it, that my school was not an ordinary one. There's a social gap between me and my classmates. They're all rich kids, do you understand? The girl said this, falling into hysteria. I'm already exhausted, trying to keep up with my wealthy friends. You're exhausted. Lovette couldn't take it anymore and was offended by her daughter. Maybe it's me who works like a horse, trying to provide you and Sandy with the best education and a decent future. I pay for your education, your clothes are fashionable, and I took out a mortgage on this apartment so that both of you could have your own room, and you turn up your nose at how I make money. It became hot in the woman's chest and a tight knot twisted in her stomach. She looked at her daughter, feeling hurt. After all, the girl was no longer a baby and should understand that money doesn't grow on trees. It's my fault. Lovette scolded herself in her thoughts. I spoiled her and indulged her whims, she realised. Lovette now understood that her daughter's self-esteem at her age depended on material possessions. With the transfer to a new school, Vanessa began to demand expensive gifts that the family couldn't afford. Lovette tried to find a balance, occasionally allowing her daughter to have expensive items for holiday, or if she saved up, for them herself. She taught Vanessa to value money, or so Lovette thought, but apparently she was mistaken. "No, Mum," the girl whined, stomping her foot. "You won't be a janitor. I'll be ashamed of you." "It's not shameful to work," her mother said firmly, signalling the end of the conversation. "We'll need the money, Vanessa. Deal with it. It's settled." Vanessa turned like a ripe tomato, shaking with anger. Her lips, painted with pink, glittery lipstick, twisted. Tears welled up in her eyes. "Don't you dare!" she yelled, throwing the apple core on the table. "Don't you dare come to my school and embarrass me, do you hear me? I don't want to be the daughter of a janitor." With these words, the teenager rushed out of the kitchen, slamming the bedroom door behind her. Lovette wanted to talk to her daughter, but stopped after taking a couple of hurried steps. She looked at the honey cake she had bought, but hadn't taken out of the bag. The woman had wanted to celebrate with her daughters that they would have an additional income now. Lovette sighed and put the box of honey cake, which the sisters loved so much, in the fridge, allowing herself to close the door with a bang. Vanessa walked through the school with her friend. She always took a spot in the middle between Erica and Rena. Vanessa had worried about fitting in when she transferred to a posh school, but she found friends quickly. All the rumours about bullying in the middle class turned out to be just gossip. No one poured glue on her chair, threw notebooks in the trash, or stuck gum in her hair. Although Vanessa wasn't sure if her classmates would be as favourable to her if they knew her mother was a nurse and a cleaner at school. That's why she told them that her mum worked in a cool clinic. Since she was surrounded only by the children of businessmen, politicians and celebrities, they themselves finalised the continuation and status of Lovette Harris. Classmates for some reason decided that Vanessa's mum was the head doctor. Vanessa did not correct them and explained that her mum was just a nurse. And how could she explain it? Erica's dad was a deputy and Rena's was a supermarket chain owner. And could she, a cheap candy, stand in the chocolate row with such a family? So Vanessa kept the truth out of her mouth. She had already learned how to lie for no reason at all. She didn't invite anyone to visit her, saying that her mother works hard and rests. Another time, she lied about the renovation. The third time, she said that some friends from Europe had come to stay and took the empty rooms. "Look," whispered Vanessa to her friend Erica. "Kevin is standing there." Vanessa raised her head and immediately blushed thickly. She liked Kevin Stapleton. It seemed that the boy reciprocated. He even bought her chocolates a couple of times, but to cover it up, he tested the others as well. A smile appeared on Vanessa's lips, but after a moment it abruptly faded. The girl's ruddy cheeks turned pale, as if the blood had fled from her face all at once. Almost beside Kevin stood her mother, dressed in a grey robe with a bandage on her head, under which she hid her thick blonde hair. On her hands, as befitting a cleaning woman, were long yellow gloves. They seemed too bright to Vanessa, attracting the attention of all the schoolchildren. Lovette wrung out the rag and began to mop the hallway floor again. It was only now that Vanessa noticed that it was damp and smelled of detergent. Vanessa even stumbled from such a picture, and if not for her friends, would have stretched out on the slippery floor. "Be careful," said Erica, holding her friend by the elbow. "It's always so slippery here when the floors are mopped. Last time, Ben from the 10th grade broke his arm." "And among the younger pupils, there are rumours that there is a magic floor here because everyone falls down," Erica remarked. "What nonsense," Rena snorted. The three of them were on a par with the cleaning lady. Lovette looked up from the floor, which she was scrubbing diligently. At that moment she met her daughter's eyes. A meek, welcoming smile appeared on the woman's face. Vanessa's heart beat faster in her chest, and her cheeks flushed again, but now with shame. "Come, quickly, soon the lesson will begin," the girl muttered. She sharply turned her head away from her mother and pulled her friends forward, trying to pass by quickly. The girl kept thinking that her mother was about to call her out and embarrass her in front of the guy she liked and in front of her best friends. But Lovette kept silent. The woman, leaning her hand on the mop handle, only gave her daughter a sad look, then, sighing heavily, went back to work. Vanessa did not like geography, and the teacher was nasty. The girl supported her chin with her fist and looked out the window, listening to the impact of man on water resources. Suddenly it turned out that something more interesting was going on outside the window than in the classroom. A guard hurried out to open the school gates. An ambulance was already rushing towards them. The paramedics were obviously in a hurry to save someone because they turned on their blinkers and sirens. The sound attracted almost the entire class. The children craned their necks to see what was happening. They murmured, "Silence!" The geography teacher raised her voice, glaring glumly at the students. "If you don't pay attention to me, you'll be writing a test." The class hurriedly reacted to the threat and synchronously looked at the teacher. Vanessa did the same, missing what was happening in the schoolyard. The class was over in 10 minutes, and the medic's car had already left, but a rumour was spreading quickly through the corridors like a forest fire. "Have you heard?" The main gossip rushed into the classroom. "They took our cleaner away in an ambulance just now." "What happened?" Rena asked with interest. "Apparently she slipped on the wet floor and hit her head. There might even be blood, because they're not letting anyone in." The other girl eagerly shared the news. "And all this in that wretched place where everyone falls. How not to believe in the cursed place?" The classmates began discussing the news, recalling who else had slipped. Only Vanessa heard them, as if through a thick layer of cotton. Her head buzzed, her temples pulsated, and her heart was crushed by a chilling fear. The girl jumped up, ignoring her friend's cries, and ran to the teacher's room. That's where she learned the terrible truth. Her mother had been taken to the hospital. "Let's go, Monkey," Vanessa said, taking her little sister's hand to lead her to school. "Will Mummy be back soon? I miss her," pouted Sandy. "And you're not good at braiding my hair, and you don't cook well." The older sister lightly pinched the girl's side. She didn't get mad at Sandy because she saw how much she missed Mum, so she misbehaved. Vanessa missed her too. Her mother had a head injury and was in treatment. That's when the doctor told Vanessa that her mother needed rest. "I'm not sure that she slipped," the doctor said. "It seems she passed out from exhaustion. She works a lot, doesn't she?" Vanessa just nodded, lowering her eyes to the floor. She felt ashamed because her mother worked hard for her and her sister. And instead of being grateful, she received demands and reproaches. "Will she be okay?" asked the schoolgirl quietly. "We'll let you know if anything changes before she regains consciousness," said the doctor. "Do you have anyone to take care of you?" "Yes," Vanessa lied, deciding to take care of herself and her sister. On the first night they spent together without their mother, Vanessa slept next to Sandy, who was very worried and cried a lot. She told her fairy tales like her mother used to, until the girl fell asleep. Only Vanessa stared at the ceiling for a long time, unable to close her eyes. She thought about what would happen if something terrible happened to her mother. If she lost her, how would she live? In their last meeting, she felt ashamed and walked past her as if she were a stranger. Vanessa wouldn't be able to forgive herself. That same night, unable to sleep, she went to her mum's room. The girl sorted her things and tidied up, even though it was well past midnight. There, Vanessa found her mother's notebook, in which she recorded expenses and the family budget. Seeing the last entry circled in bright marker, Vanessa burst into tears. Tears dripped onto the lined pages, smudging the ink, but the girl couldn't stop. She understood why her mother had been working harder. Lovette was saving up for a trip to the sea. Vanessa was obsessed with the idea, and she didn't even know that for her birthday, which was in July, her mother had planned to give her the most desired gift, a trip to the sea. She had saved the necessary amount listed in the notebook. She had written down not only the prices of the tickets, but also accommodation and even excursions planning the trip. Vanessa looked around the room again. She rarely came in and rarely looked at her mother's things. Now, however, she realized something very important. Her mother had very few clothes, and they were old. Her down jacket, for one, needed replacing long ago, but Lovette didn't do it. She spent money on new things for Sandy, who was growing up fast, and clothes for Vanessa, who always demanded fashionable clothing. Vanessa pulled out her mother's old down jacket, which smelled of her mother and perfume. She hugged it and sat on the floor, crying bitterly. "Forgive me, Mummy. Just come back, please. I'll make it right. I'll honestly make it right. I love you so much," the girl whispered until she fell asleep. The next morning, they called from the hospital and informed the sisters that their mother had regained consciousness, but they couldn't visit her yet. Vanessa felt immense relief upon hearing that her mother would be okay. She decided to do everything in her power to keep her promise and improve herself. That's how Vanessa took on the role of her mother. She took care of Sandy as best she could. The girl realized that clean clothes don't magically appear on shelves, and their refrigerator doesn't prepare dinner. But most importantly, what the girls lacked was not oatmeal in the morning, but their mother's support. Now Vanessa understood how difficult it was to be a mother. She appreciated her more and more with each passing day. When Lovette returned from the hospital, her daughters ran to her with hugs. Vanessa grabbed her bag, scolding her for immediately starting to carry heavy things and going to the store instead of home. "You need still to rest. That's what the doctor said," the girl said, shaking her head. "I was gone for such a short time, and it feels like you've grown up so much," her mother smiled, hugging her daughters. Gradually, family life returned to normal. After a couple of weeks, Vanessa learned that her mother was going back to work at the school. "No, you can't," the girl exclaimed, and Lovette frowned. "I thought we already discussed this. I won't tell anyone that I'm your mother. Besides, now I'll come around to the 5th lesson. Your classes will be over. We won't even see each other." "That's not it," Vanessa said sadly. She couldn't find the words. Her throat was tight. For some reason, it was easier for the teenager to curse than to admit her mistakes and explain how much she worried about her mother. She no longer wanted to go to the sea and didn't want a designer bag like Rena's. She realized that the greatest wealth was her mother. She didn't need gifts as long as her mother was healthy and with her, always. Lovette did not notice the confusion of her daughter. She looked at her watch and fussed. "There's no time to argue, Nessie. I have to go." The school day went without incident. Vanessa even got an A in her least favourite subject, geography, which made her proud. The girl and her friends walked through the school hallway and approached the mirror to touch up their lipstick before leaving. After taking out her gloss, the girl noticed with the edge of her eye a familiar figure and a spot of canary gloves. She turned around and saw her mother hunched over the floor. A strand of hair had slipped out from under her scarf and was falling into her eyes. Lovette stopped working a couple of times, trying to move it with her elbow so as not to touch her face with her gloves, but it stubbornly returned to its place. When Lovette lifted her head again, she saw her daughter. She froze in place, looked at her friends, then turned sharply, hiding her face. Vanessa's heart tightened in a vice. She threw her lipstick back into her bag. It was the same expensive lipstick she had begged her mother for and received as a gift. "Girls," Vanessa called out to her friends decisively. "I'm sorry, go without me. I want to help my mum." Erica and Rena exchanged surprised glances. They recognized the woman who had been taken away by the doctors, and now they watched in shock as Vanessa approached her. The girl touched her mother's shoulder, making her turn around. Lovette was surprised, even scared, when she noticed her daughter. "What's wrong, Nessie?" she gasped. Meanwhile, Vanessa smiled and fixed her mother's hair so it wouldn't get in the way. She rolled up the sleeves of her shirt. "What can I help you with, Mum? We'll get it done faster together, and then we can go home," she suggested. Tears welled up in Lovette's eyes as she assured her daughter that she didn't need help, but Vanessa was determined. Together they managed and then picked up Sandy from after-school care and went home. On the way they bought a honey cake, which they found delicious. On Monday, when Vanessa went to school, she saw Erica and Rena whispering to Kevin. She felt her reputation in class had been ruined. Trying to avoid her former friends, she escaped during breaks, but she couldn't hide for long. After the 5th lesson, the girls and Kevin caught up with her. "We know about your mum," said Erica, looking at Vanessa disapprovingly. "I'm sorry I lied. She works at the hospital, but she works as a nurse," replied Vanessa. "I don't care what you think of our family. My mum raises me and Sandy alone, and she works very hard. I love her." "Do you think I'm angry because your mum cleans the school?" Erica shouted. "Did you think I wouldn't be friends with you because of that? Did you think I was completely nasty? And when your mum got into the hospital, you went alone but didn't tell us anything. Is that what friends do?" Vanessa looked on in shock as Erica cried, smudging her expensive mascara on her cheeks. She cried because she was upset with Vanessa and because she felt sorry for her friend. Vanessa couldn't hold back her tears either and hugged Erica and Rena tightly. Kevin, who didn't participate in the general hysteria, stood modestly nearby and smiled. However, the big surprise for Vanessa and her mother was that the daughter of a politician and the daughter of a businessman teamed up to help them. Kevin carried buckets of water, and the work went quickly and very cheerfully. As a reward for their help, Lovette invited her friends over. Vanessa finally brought them home without making up any stories. The girls were thrilled with her room because her mother allowed her to put up her favourite posters and decorate it to her taste. Their own rooms looked like museums and were the work of designers. "I don't even like pink," Rena complained, "but it's apparently trendy. So my walls are pink, and even my furniture." Erica played with Sandy, and it turned out she loved children. Kevin couldn't tear himself away from the home cooking. "We have a home cook," he said with a mouthful. "He cooks something very fancy, healthy, and absolutely tasteless. Can I come to you more often?" Seeing the plea in the boy's eyes, Lovette and Vanessa just laughed and said he could come whenever he wanted. Vanessa realized that happiness is not something that can be bought. True happiness is free, and it has always been nearby. It's sincere friendship and love from a mother and sister. And she also knew that they would go to the sea. Only she would help earn the money herself. After all, it was her turn to make gifts for her beloved mother. Kimberly vividly remembered the day when Ellen first appeared on their doorstep. Her grandmother brought her to the house, holding her hand. The skinny, frightened girl tried to hide behind the woman and did not dare to look up. Kimberly remembered how decisively she reached out her hand to Ellen and cheerfully offered, "Let's make friends. My name is Kimberly, and this is my grandmother." These words made the strange girl even more confused, and tears appeared in her eyes. "No, mine," she said quietly. Greta decided to intervene so that the girl's introduction did not turn into a quarrel. In a conciliatory tone, but strictly enough, she said, addressing both of them, "Now, I am your common granny, and I do not allow anyone to argue and quarrel. We will live peacefully and amicably, and you will definitely become real sisters." With these words, she pulled both orphans to her and hugged them with all the tenderness and love that her big heart was capable of. Kimberly immediately found out that the new girl was a year younger than her, and this discovery calmed her down a bit. Feeling more grown up at 6, she decided to take care of her newly acquired younger sister. Ellen, who had recently lost her mother, often cried at first and asked Greta to take her to her. Kimberly saw that her grandmother was very upset every time she heard these words. She used to take Ellen on her lap and began to calm and comfort her. It made Kimberly sad too, and in such moments she moved closer to her grandmother and tried to press her cheek, at least a little, against the warmth of her body. Grandmother always smelled perfect, sometimes of apple soap, sometimes of sweet baked goods, and sometimes of mint tea, which she loved to brew in a small old teapot with a chipped spout. Kimberly never knew her mother. Greta's daughter died in childbirth, and her grandmother replaced the little girl's mother at birth. She also did not remember her father. Her grandmother told her that for the first 6 months he lived with his daughter, then went to another city to earn money, and only appeared in their house a few times when he came to the city to reissue some documents. In the last few years, there was no news of him, but Kimberly herself did not remember him. He remained for her as an unknown with an old picture. Greta often told Kimberly about her mother. The girl loved to go through her mother's pictures in an old album, where she was a very young girl with braids sticking out in different directions. Kimberly found out where Ellen had come from in their house much later. Just one winter evening, her grandmother decided to tell the girls about her acquaintance with Kimberly's mother. "I was working as a nurse at our local hospital at that time. Maggie, my daughter, was still small, and I gave birth to her late, at 40. And your mother, Ellen, I was like a mother to her, because there was almost a 20-year age difference between us. We worked together with your mother, Ellen, for almost 15 years. She, like me, could not give birth to a child for a long time. I remember how she often complained to me, and I comforted her and said, 'Look at me. God gave me a child when I was 38, when I did not expect it, and He will bless you.' And she did wait. I remember how Michelle rejoiced when she learned that she was expecting a daughter. She baked a big cake and treated us all, and then I retired. My health wasn't excellent after Maggie's death, and I had to take care of Kimberly. That's how your mother and I lost each other for a while. But when I found out that Michelle died of heart disease, I immediately went to you, Ellen. I know Michelle raised you alone. She had no relatives, and no one knows who your father was. Michelle didn't say anything about him. I came and you were such a sacred little mouse. My heart couldn't take it, and I took you to my home. I'll never forgive myself for losing Michelle like that. It was hard for me, and it wasn't any easier for her. We had to stick together. And you, little girls, may not be blood sisters, but I'm sure you'll be closer to each other than some blood sisters. So don't ever lose each other. Together you can handle any trouble." Despite the age difference, Greta put the girls in the same class. She did not want to separate them, and she did the right thing. The girls always stood up for each other and didn't let anyone hurt them. Ellen and Kimberly always sat together at the same desk, went to school together, and came home together. Together they fell in love with the same boy for the first time and almost quarrelled because of him forever. Then, at the same moment, they suggested making peace with each other and never quarrelling over trifles again. And together, they decided to enroll in the same college. It was costly to study full-time. Money was always in short supply. A year later, Kimberly and Ellen switched to distance learning. The girls immediately got a job as cleaners in a small company, and after work, they worked hard on their college lectures. But Kimberly could not endure half a year of such a hectic life, and having said goodbye, her grandmother and sister went to conquer the capital. For the first time in many years, the sisters went their separate ways. Ellen was distressed about Kimberly, who became less frequent with her calls. Probably the capital life caught her in its whirlwind. Unfortunately, soon Ellen's worries and anxieties increased. Her grandmother's health had taken a sharp turn. Whether it was loneliness or old age that had affected her, Greta had been complaining more and more about her eyesight. She became almost blind and practically walked around the house blindly. "When will Kimberly come?" the elderly woman used to ask anxiously. "I'll go blind soon and won't see my granddaughter any more." Ellen now tried to spend as much time with her grandmother as possible. This became increasingly difficult because Ellen had met a man, and one day the young woman confessed to her grandmother that he had already proposed to her. "How wonderful, granddaughter! We will have your wedding, and Kimberly will come too. It will be so good. I've already given up on seeing her again. Our dear capital dweller has forgotten about us," Greta said. Ellen called her sister, and she seemed happy for her, but Kimberly's voice was somewhat distant and seemed a little upset. "What's going on with you? Why haven't you called? Grandma has become very ill. She sits by the window more and more often with your pictures, and even though she can hardly see anything, she tries to catch a glimpse of you on the path leading to the house. Are you going to come to my wedding at least?" "Ellen, I'll try my best. I'll come, and you'll see for yourself what's going on with me. I don't know if our meeting will be happy or not, but I simply can't miss admiring you in your wedding dress." Kimberly's strange hints aroused even more suspicions, and Ellen couldn't sleep and kept thinking about what her sister was hiding from her. She never told them the time of her arrival, and the elderly lady watched her granddaughter from her unchanging post, catching the first rays of the sun. "Ellen, look who's coming!" she would shout every time a shadow appeared on the horizon. "No, Grandma, that's not Kimberly. That's Mr. Smith going to the store." "And who's behind him?" "Oh, that's Mrs. Campbell carrying the mail." When Kimberly finally appeared on the path in front of the house, no one ever believed it was her. But the woman didn't look like herself at all. She had dyed her long blonde hair a dark chestnut colour. But that wasn't what bothered Ellen. Kimberly was at least 6 months pregnant. Greta did her best to see her beloved granddaughter and couldn't believe that the plump woman was her tiny, fragile Kimberly. "Yes, it's me, Grandma," Kimberly laughed, and Greta cried with joy. "This is my Kimberly's voice. Come to me, baby, and let me hug you. How big you've become. Are you pregnant?" "Why didn't you tell us anything?" Ellen asked, hurt. "Are we strangers to you?" "What's there to say? You see, I went to the capital and achieved success and recognition," Kimberly replied bitterly and sarcastically. "My job was the simplest. I was a waitress in a restaurant. Now I don't work there anymore. They asked me to leave. My belly is too big. I've returned to you for good, if you'll have me back." "Of course we will. And what about the father of the child?" "Father? Well, he doesn't need me, and he doesn't need my children either." "Children? Are you having more than one child?" "I'm expecting twins. That's why my belly is so big. I only found out recently." "So it turns out I will soon be an aunt twice," Ellen exclaimed happily and hugged her sister. Then Kimberly and Greta also sat hugging each other for a long time. Kimberly cried like a child, complaining about her fate, and her grandmother pitied her like she did when she was a child. "Kimberly, what happened to your man? Did he chicken out?" Greta asked carefully. "Perhaps he got scared, or maybe he listened to his mother. I thought he loved me and I trusted him, but it turned out to be a mummy's boy. His mother told him to leave me, and he obeyed like a trained puppy. I cried for a whole week. I couldn't even go to work, and when I finally did, I was told that I was laid off. I tried to find a job in the capital, but worked somewhere else for a while. But who needs a pregnant woman? It's a good thing Ellen called and invited me home. Otherwise, I probably wouldn't have dared to show up like this. A complete failure, and pregnant too. Don't talk nonsense. This is your home. You are welcome here at any time of day or night, said Grandma sternly and kindly, like she used to in childhood. And your children will be welcome here too. Of course, sis, confirmed Ellen. We won't abandon you. We will help you. Kimberly came to Ellen's wedding with a smile on her face. Her heart had calmed down a bit, and she felt the support of her loved ones. She was happy for Ellen, who was getting married for love, and was therefore blooming like a delicate, fragile flower, with thin, transparent petals and a heady aroma. After the wedding, time flew quickly, but the last few months were very difficult for Kimberly, because the huge belly, which constantly hurt her back, she was worried about her constant weakness. Kimberly tried not to worry, but her condition was getting worse. The doctors didn't like her symptoms, and it was decided to schedule the birth 2 weeks earlier to examine Kimberly as soon as possible and find the cause of her constant weakness. When the first snow covered the ground, 2 brothers were born, Timothy and David. The boys were very weak, but the doctors reassured that there would be no serious problems with the babies. After examining Kimberly, the doctors gave her a terrible diagnosis: cancer. How can this be? Ellen cried. You're still so young. The terrible news shook both sisters. Ellen walked as black as a cloud. Kimberly seemed to lose all her life force shortly. We won't tell Grandma. She won't be able to handle such news, Ellen decided. We will fight together, you and me. I will go with you to the doctor, sit next to you, and hold your hand if you really feel bad. It won't work. One of us has to be with the children, and we'll have to tell Grandma, otherwise she'll never forgive us. I'll try to pull through for the sake of the children. I have to live so that my babies won't be orphans like us. But when the apple trees bloomed in the garden, they buried Kimberly. Cancer destroyed her in a matter of months, giving her no chance to fight for her life. During those few months that Kimberly was dying of a terrible disease, everything around her was falling apart. Ellen and her husband's relationship gradually deteriorated. Their newly blossoming love couldn't withstand the heavy trial. Ellen was constantly with her sister and her babies, and her husband was moving away from her more and more. Ellen saw this, but she couldn't sacrifice her sister for the sake of a man. Grandma had finally gone blind. The terrible news of her granddaughter's illness fell on her like a huge stone. She seemed to have cried out the remnants of her vision, and now lived in complete darkness. The only ones who made both women at least a little happy were Timothy and David. The boys were growing stronger every day. What will happen to the kids now? Greta looked into the void in front of her with her sightless gaze. I guess you'll have to put them in an orphanage, Ellen. It's a pity for the boys, but I can't take care of them myself. I need help myself. And you're still so young. Your family is falling apart. You've had enough of taking care of everyone with us. It's time for me to think about myself. What are you talking about, Grandma? Ellen protested, hearing her words. You didn't give me away to an orphanage, but now you are suggesting to give up Kimberly's children away. I'll never abandon her promise, and I'll adopt them. If my husband doesn't support me, let him go. Why do I need a man who won't lend a hand in a difficult moment? Ellen, my girl, how will you cope alone? Grandma, remember how you told Kimberly that there are good people around? I'll manage somehow, and you, for now, will help me with your kind words, if not deeds. Pressing the little ones to herself, hugging their little warm bodies, and remembering her dead sister, Ellen often cried, softly and bitterly. She did not want to upset her grandmother, and tried to seem strong, but she was terribly scared inside. The children's welfare authorities could easily take the boys away from them. To adopt the boys, it was necessary that Ellen's husband gave his consent, but he categorically refused. Divorce loomed on the horizon, but Ellen didn't know if it would solve the adoption problems. And then she decided to find the boy's father. Ellen remembered what Kimberly said about him, a weak-willed mama's boy. Maybe he didn't know anything about their fate or about the children. After all, he was sent somewhere in France for an internship at some Michelin restaurant. Ellen was determined to find him in the capital, but first she had to solve the problem of who would temporarily take care of the kids and the grandmother while she was away. But the world is not without kind people, as her grandmother used to say. After agreeing with kind neighbours to look after the children and grandmother, Ellen headed to the capital. She only knew that the child's father's name was Peter, and he was the administrator of a restaurant that belonged to his mother until they sent him away from his pregnant fiancée. On her first day in the city, Ellen found the place where his sister Kimberly used to work. The capital's restaurant was very respectable and clearly brought a considerable income to its owners. "Hello, I need Peter," she decisively announced to the waiter in the way. "Mr. Barron?" he clarified. Yes, probably. He worked here as an administrator 2 years ago. He's the owner's son." "We have a different administrator now. Maybe you need to go to him, or—" "I don't need an administrator. I need Peter. I have a personal matter with him." All the way through, Ellen turned herself into the fact that she wouldn't be timid in front of the capital folks. There was too much at stake, and she, realizing this, spoke confidently and even too arrogantly. But the experienced waiter just smiled and said, "Mr. Barron is on a procurement run now, but his mother is here. Maybe you want to talk to her?" "Great, she's the one I need. Let me through." And Ellen resolutely walked into the hall. There were many visitors, but with some unerring intuition, she identified the owner as a stately, slender lady, closely watching how a young man and men in impeccably formal uniforms were bustling between tables. She remembered what Kimberly told her about the rules at the previous job: no frivolity with customers, no romance between employees. "Mrs. Barron, hello. I'm here on behalf of Kimberly. Do you remember Kimberly Dewar?" Ellen went on the offensive right away. "Quietly, girl, there's no need to shout. Let's go to my office and talk calmly there." They went into the director's office, and Constance gestured for Ellen to sit down. "Who are you to Kimberly?" Constance asked. She tried to remain calm, but it was clear that she was nervous. "I'm her sister." "And what do you want, sister? Money? A job?" The woman literally hissed, her whole body beginning to shake with anger. "Did you know she was expecting a baby?" "Of course you have known. She gave birth to twins." "Excellent, congratulations, but what does that have to do with me?" "You have nothing to do with it, except that you did everything you could to make the children grow up without a father." Both women were so excited about the conversation that they didn't notice Peter entering the office. He was still a very young man, but it turned out that the last 2 years spent in France among grown-up, independent and enthusiastic people, far away from his authoritarian mother, had not passed without a trace for him. And the last thing Ellen said was overheard by him. "Mum, I don't understand. What children?" "Son, it's none of your business. This woman got the wrong address and she's leaving," Constance said, glaring threateningly at Ellen. But she had picked the wrong person to threaten. The once delicate and frail Ellen had turned into a tigress after a year of suffering and loss, ready to fight to the death for her children. "You are mistaken, ma'am. I am in the right address, and it's not your business at all. I am here for Mr. Barron." Ellen stressed the surname, showing the young man that he was a grown-up who should answer for himself and his actions. "Mum, leave us," Peter asked his mother. "Don't listen to this troublemaker, Sonny." "Mum, I'll handle it. Please leave the room." The woman glared angrily at Ellen and left, slamming the door. To say that Peter was shocked after hearing Ellen's story would be an understatement. He didn't try to justify himself. Ellen already understood that he had no idea that his ex-girlfriend had given birth, let alone to twins, and the news of Kimberly's death had left him stunned. He was convinced that she had left him, gone somewhere unknown, and get rid of the pregnancy, as his mother had told him. He didn't have her home address, and to his great shame, he didn't bother to find out or even call her. If she didn't wait for him in France, it was fate. After listening to Ellen, he didn't start to find out the details of the role his mother had played in all this. It was all behind him, and nothing could be undone. But a mother was a mother, and he had no other, and would not have another. But he had children now, and there was Ellen, whom they considered their mother, and there was an elderly woman who raised Ellen and Kimberly. Not much time passed, and Ellen, agreeing with Peter's arguments, brought her entire family to his apartment. At first, she didn't want to hear about it, but seeing him travel 1,000 kilometers every week to see the little ones, she realized that it couldn't go on like this. The decisive factor was the fact that he lived independently in his own separate apartment, which meant that his mother would not interfere in their lives. But Ellen was surprised when Constance appeared on their doorstep just a couple of weeks after they moved to the capital. Ellen immediately tensed up because Peter was not at home, and she did not feel like a mistress in his house, and she was not, in fact. But her tigress reaction, guarding the interests of her children, worked almost instantly. "What do you want? Why are you here?" "I came in peace, Ellen. Please forgive me and understand." "I'll never understand people like you," Ellen replied. "I was raised and brought up not by my natural grandmother, and she loved me like I was her own. But what about you? You're not poor people, but you abandoned your own grandchildren." "Ellen, the point is that we have to find a common language. I know something you don't know yet. My son loves you, he told me, but he forbade you to talk about it. He was afraid you would refuse to move in with him. But I've lived my life and understood that sooner or later, you two will be together. And not just for the children's sake. Please don't deprive me of my son and my grandchildren. I already made a mistake once, driving pregnant Kimberly away and deceiving Peter. Let me make it right." Since that conversation, there have been many more meetings and other conversations, and in the end, Ellen forgave Peter's mother. Constance met her grandchildren and became attached to them with all her heart. It was impossible not to love these two little ones, who looked like 2 peas in a pod, and like their dad in their childhood. A little more time passed, and Ellen and Peter got married, and soon Ellen told her grandmother that she would become a great-grandmother again. After all, Timothy and David were going to have a little sister. However, that's a completely different story. "Help me hang the laundry, Jenna," came Grandma's voice from outside. Jenna never refused her grandmother's requests for help around the house. "Well, the laundry is almost done. Let's go cook dinner," suggested the grandma 10 minutes later. Though they lived only the two of them, with no one else to feed, they still prepared Sunday dinner on weekends on a regular basis. They always covered the round table with a white tablecloth, put Grandma's favourite set on it, decorated it with unpretentious bouquet of flowers, and put the most delicious food on the table. It had always been a tradition in their little family. "Well, even though there are no men in the house, we will pamper ourselves," Mrs. Fox liked to say. "You know, Jenna, even a family as tiny as ours must have traditions. It is easier and happier to live with tradition, because there is always something unchanging and immutable. Traditions are a great thing, Jenna. When you have your family, your husband and children, you should set the table for a family dinner on Sunday. Then everyone will know in advance that it's a day off and they need to stay at home, discuss things, advise the younger ones, and get advice from the older ones. Jenna had always dreamed of having a large family since childhood. Not that it was bad for them to be alone with her grandmother, but the girl yearned for a father or an older brother. She wanted to know and understand what it was like to receive a man's protection and support. Her friend Heather, on the other hand, could threaten offenders by calling her older brother, who was a boxer, or her father, who was a policeman. Unfortunately, Jenna didn't even have a grandfather. Her grandmother and an old dog named Finn, who once served with the neighbour's nephew on the border, were her most important protectors. When the dog grew old, they wanted to put him to sleep, but Grandma took Finn to her place. He lived 7 more years, though he became almost deaf and blind. The old dog always accompanied Mrs. Fox to the train when she left their small village on business for the city. When Jenna grew older and went to college in the city, he made sure to see her off every day. "Finn, you don't have to follow me," Jenna often said angrily. She was very sorry for the old dog. "Look, you're barely walking. Go back to your seat." For a while, the dog still tried to waddle after his beloved younger mistress. But soon his strength finally left him, and he could only look sadly after her. "Someday, like you, I won't be able to see our Jenna off or greet her properly," Mrs. Fox saddened, looking at the old dog. "Why such gloomy thoughts, Grandma? You're only 67 years old. I still have you. You'll have great-grandchildren. It's certain." "Oh, I'd like to believe it, Jenna," sighed Grandma, "but I don't know if I'll be healthy enough." Finn died while Jenna was in the city. When she came back, she saw the old dog frozen in waiting, who had never managed to meet his mistress for the last time. The girl cried for a long time. After a week, she wanted to bring home a new puppy so that she and her grandmother would not be so sad. "No need, granddaughter," Mrs. Fox asked her. "You have to go to the city anyway, and it will be difficult for me to look after the dog alone. I'm getting old. I don't have much strength left." Jenna was very upset, listening to the complaints of her dearest person. She didn't want to move to the city, and she continued to travel there every day by train, even after finding a job there. But thanks to these trips, she met her destiny. One autumn evening, returning home at dusk, she saw a group of drunken local hooligans beating up a stranger. The incident was not far from the railroad station. Apparently he could not leave this inhospitable neighbourhood in peace. While Jenna was running to the location where the fight had taken place, the attackers had already fled. It wasn't surprising that they quickly left, because the girl screamed at the top of her voice and called the police. The poor guy was lying in a pool of his own blood, with a broken nose and a couple of broken ribs. It was not easy for him to stand up either. Jenna called an ambulance, and, not wanting to leave the stranger alone in a strange city, went with him to the hospital. David, as the guy's name was, turned out to be an interesting man. He and Jenna became friends, and the girl began to visit him in the hospital, where she also met his parents. "Jenna, you're like a guardian angel for our son. If you hadn't arrived in time, who knows how things would have ended," said David's mother one day. The guys who attacked David were found. As it turned out, the drunken group spotted a stranger, and alcohol, as was often the case in such situations, gave them a sense of permissiveness. One thing led to another, and David was drawn into the fight against his will. And when the passion settled down, his attackers didn't even remember why they had attacked a stranger. "You'll be like a daughter to us now, Jenna. Come to visit. My husband and I will always be happy to see you," David's mother persuaded Jenna. The man was discharged from the hospital, and his parents came to take him home. David and Jenna smiled conspiratorially at each other. They had not yet told David's parents that they had decided to get married. "Mum, you won't believe this, but you're really going to see a lot of Jenna now," David informed them with a wink. "You have no idea how often. I invited Jenna to come and live with us. We've been a couple for 2 weeks now, and yesterday I proposed, and Jenna agreed. So, get ready, Mum, for the wedding." David's parents were surprised by such a hasty decision by the young couple, but on the other hand, they were happy for their son. They liked Jenna very much, and they were glad that the girl who had so touchingly taken care of their David all this time would become his wife. "Don't worry about me, Jenna," her grandmother comforted her. "I'll be all right. If anything, the neighbour will help. Go to the city. You can't stay near me forever. Therefore go and be happy. And if you're happy, I'll be happy too." Mrs. Fox hugged her granddaughter, and the girl realized that her grandmother was letting her go with a light heart. The wedding took place at the end of January, and in early March, Jenna and David learned that they would soon become parents. The spring brought great happiness into their lives. David's parents and Mrs. Fox constantly called each other, and the grandma knew all the news in the young couple's life. "And I already know that you went for an ultrasound yesterday," the elderly woman joyfully reported to her granddaughter. "David's mum has already told me everything. How are you feeling? Can you come to me on Easter? I've cleaned the house, and I'll get some more aromatic herbs. We'll have Sunday dinner like we used to." Throughout the summer, Jenna enjoyed her pregnancy. She often visited her grandmother in the village, mostly with her husband on weekends. Mrs. Fox enjoyed these visits as a small child enjoys a new toy, and Jenna and David never denied her the pleasure of being with them. In the village, Jenna often met her best friend Heather, who also came to her parents on weekends as she worked in the city. "How I envy you, Jenna. David is so kind and caring, unlike my last suitor. I always end up dating some kind of moral freak or couch potato. Oh, by the way, do you remember Helen? She has a terrible story. Her husband turned out to be an abuser." "Who?" Jenna thought she hadn't heard correctly. "Well, he was an abuser. It turns out that she was often humiliated and beaten by him, and she didn't tell anyone. Maybe Helen was embarrassed or afraid, who knows. Recently, he even locked her in the house for 3 days because he was jealous and wouldn't let her out. Thankfully, the neighbours called the police, and she was eventually released. Now, they have a case against the jealous husband. Helen confessed that he had been torturing her like that for years." "What a horror," marvelled Jenna. She realised how lucky she was to have David. They were like two halves of the same whole, separated at birth by fate, but able to meet thanks to chance. Jenna couldn't even imagine that David could look at her badly, let alone raise his hand against her. Listening to Heather's stories was like listening to horror stories. A happy childhood with her beloved grandmother and a successful marriage with a loving husband had shielded Jenna from many horrors that might have come her way. "David, you know, I've been thinking, and I've realised how lucky we are. Few people are so fortunate. Some people live with someone they don't love, suffer from, or can't have children with. But we, thank God, are doing well. Aren't we?" David nodded silently and kissed her tenderly. He really loved his wife and couldn't imagine how his life would have turned out if he hadn't met her that cold autumn evening. And now it was autumn again. Jenna was 7 months pregnant. She and her husband now knew they were expecting a boy and had even chosen the name Thomas in honour of David's grandfather. "My grandfather was a decent man with a big heart," David said. "He was smart. He grew up without a father. His great-grandfather was killed in the war. From his early youth he got used to carrying the whole family on his back. All our successes, especially our current ones, are thanks to him." Jenna listened and smiled. She was ready to call her son any name her husband chose, because she trusted him completely in everything. She trusted her life and the life of their future child. Jenna enjoyed strolling through the autumn park, rustling the golden leaves and inhaling the warm smell of fallen leaves in peace. Sometimes she would sit on a bench and quietly talk to her baby, saying, "Tommy, we are all waiting for you very much. You will be a happy baby, coming into this world with the most loving, friendly family. I can't wait to see your eyes, your tiny hands and feet, and kiss your tiny nose, my sunshine." That afternoon, Jenna was returning from a walk when a passerby car suddenly flew out at her from almost nowhere. She was leisurely walking across the road on the crosswalk, and the last thing she remembered was the horrible sound of brakes and a thud from the side. She didn't even have time to fully realize that the out-of-control driver had hit her and thrown her aside. Days later, Jenna woke up in the hospital. "She came to her senses," was the first phrase she heard. Her grandmother was next to her, and her face was swollen from days of sleep deprivation and tears. Jenna couldn't understand what had happened to her. "Grandma, why am I in the hospital? I don't remember anything," Jenna asked. "Granddaughter, we'll talk later, not now," her grandmother replied. Jenna was confused and wanted to know the truth about her condition. "Grandma, tell me honestly, what's wrong with me?" "Jenna, you were hit by a car. You have many bruises and a concussion. Let's talk more about it later. You need to rest now," her grandmother said, trying to comfort her. "And the baby?" cried the woman, fearfully, only now realizing that the accident might have harmed the child. Mrs. Fox did not answer. She turned away from her granddaughter so that she would not see the tears running down her cheeks. "No, it's not true!" Jenna screamed. "He's here! He's with me! I can feel him! Just like before!" "Jenna, honey, calm down, please. You're still young. The doctor said you can still have children." "I don't want other children. I want my Tommy!" Jenna was terrifying to look at. The swelling had not yet gone down on her face, and bruises and cuts were visible everywhere. But that was not what was frightening. The woman's gaze was completely insane. At the sound of her scream, a nurse rushed in and injected Jenna with a sedative. The woman fell into a deep sleep. While she slept, all her loved ones gathered at her bedside, trying to find out from the doctor what they should do with Jenna now. "You need to understand that she has more than just a head injury. It's quite possible that the stress she's been under is going to cause mental problems in the near future. You should definitely show her to a good psychiatrist." Things were terrible for Jenna at home. She refused to accept the truth. The woman was still talking to the baby that was no longer in her belly. She didn't want to believe that her little angel had flown off to heaven and kept singing songs to him, dreaming of what he would grow up to be. "My little son, my little sunshine, how I long to see your eyes, your tiny hands, your tiny feet, and to kiss your tiny nose. My joy." It was impossible to watch all this without crying. The whole family felt like they were starting to go crazy along with Jenna. "We need to solve the question of hospitalization at the mental clinic urgently," insisted David's father. "Dad, well, how can I leave her now? She needs me. I want to be with Jenna." "Well, then the two of you will go crazy. Who's going to feel better?" A couple of days later, it got worse. Jenna stopped responding to people at home. She would either stare at one point or start pacing the house thoughtfully, as if looking for someone. "All right, I'll go and talk to the doctor, and then I'll take her too." David finally gave up. But when he returned home, Jenna was not in the house. "I only ran to the grocery store for a minute," David's mother excused herself. "How did I know she would want to go out?" The whole family rushed to look for the missing woman, but Jenna was nowhere to be found. David and his father immediately went to the village where her grandmother lived, but even there Jenna was not found. She did not show up at home the next day either. Soon the police were looking for her, but couldn't find her anywhere. It was as if Jenna had vanished into thin air. David could not find a place for his grief. He looked for his beloved wherever she had been before. He went to acquaintances and distant relatives of the family and wandered through parks and forests as if a ghost. He questioned random passers-by and pasted wanted posters on poles and the walls of houses. All acquaintances and strangers helped him. Heather, Jenna's friend, was especially worried and tried to help. "David, do not worry. We will definitely find her, and the police will not abandon us. My father promised that they would not stop looking for her." Time passed, but there was no progress in Jenna's case. So, 5 years had passed. Sadly, Jenna had to be officially recognized as dead. During these years, Heather was at David's side. Their common grief had united them. Eventually, they decided to link their fates. David's mother blamed herself for the disappearance of her first daughter-in-law, but was glad that David had come to terms with what happened and had finally begun to build a new relationship with Jenna's friend. She liked Heather, but feared there was no real love between her son and this woman. However, life showed that the young couple had indeed fallen in love with each other and had already begun to dream of having a child. After getting married, the couple decided to go on a honeymoon, not abroad, but to the cultural capital of the country, which Heather had long dreamed of visiting. She wanted to see all the museums, famous monuments of architecture. David had once studied in this city and still had some friends from his youth there. "Heather, did you know that there is a kissing bridge in this city? We must go there first," whispered David, hugging his wife. "There is an old belief. If newlyweds start kissing on one side of the river, continue on the bridge, and kiss until they reach the other side of the river, they will live happily ever after, together." They did just that. It was the happiest day of Heather's life, even happier than their wedding, which they decided not to make big and lavish, but with only their closest friends and relatives in attendance. When they kissed on the bridge, all the people around them smiled, admiring this beautiful and joyful couple. When they reached the other side of the river, Heather told her husband that she had saved one surprise until then. She was pregnant. David picked his wife up in his arms and spun her around. He was crazy with happiness. "David, be careful, put me down immediately," Heather asked, laughing. "What are our plans for the near future?" "Now, we will go for a walk, admire the sights, and then go to the hotel. But tomorrow, my old friend is waiting for us for Sunday lunch. Michael and I studied together. We lived in the same room in the student dormitory. We haven't seen each other for many years. Can you imagine? He has a son who just turned 3 years old the other day. When he found out we'd be here, he asked me not to plan anything on Sunday. They have a tradition, Sunday dinners, just like we do when I and Jenna—" David stopped himself abruptly. "Oh, it's okay, David," said Heather, trying not to show her pain. "Jenna took this tradition from her grandmother, but other people also have this tradition. Anyway, I'd love to visit your friend." David felt very guilty, and therefore he was especially tender and attentive towards his wife that evening. The next day they bought gifts for a friend's family, flowers, cognac, and a children's motorcycle on batteries. And soon a joyful David and Heather were standing on the threshold of Michael's apartment, exactly at the appointed time. The friends embraced. Michael invited his friends to come into the living room. "Jenna, we have guests. Meet my friend David and his wife Heather." What happened next cannot be described in words. Michael was bewildered as Heather, essentially a stranger, rushed towards his wife, sobbing to embrace her. Meanwhile, David, white as chalk, began to say something absurd in Michael's opinion. "Jenna, but you died 5 years ago. It's impossible. Where have you been all this time? Oh my goodness." It all seemed like the ravings of a madman, but as Michael looked at his wife, he began to guess something. When he first met Jenna 5 years prior, she had no documents, no money, and most importantly, she was in a semi-delirious state and remembered absolutely nothing, either about who she was or what had happened to her. But now, as Jenna was shifting her gaze from Heather to David, it was as if a veil fell from her eyes. "Tommy, my little son!" This was the first thing Jenna said after several heavy minutes of silence, and she began to cry. "Jenna," Michael, embracing his wife and addressing her like a little child, reassured her. "Our son's name is Chris." Jenna fainted, and David's pregnant wife wasn't in the best condition either. It was hard to believe, but Jenna had been found. And found when no one was looking for her. Only Jenna's grandmother had prayed until now and believed that her granddaughter was alive. That's why, when all 4 of them slowly began to come to their senses, the first thing they did was call Jenna's grandmother. Throughout the years, David and Heather had not forgotten about the elderly lady. They often called her and supported her as best they could, both morally and financially. After Jenna's disappearance, Mrs. Fox had been very ill, and only the hope of meeting her granddaughter and the medicine and vitamins that David brought her had somehow kept her alive. "Mrs. Fox, good afternoon." David decided to call his grandmother-in-law first. The young people were afraid that, hearing Jenna's voice on the receiver, the elderly woman might feel ill at such a surprise. "How are you feeling?" David asked. "Oh, David, thank you. I'm doing well. How are you? How's Heather?" "We're doing well too, and we have some good news for you. About Jenna. We found her. She's alive and she's doing great. She had lost her memory back then, but she remembers everything now. I'll put her on the phone." During Jenna's conversation with her grandma, there were many tears and few words. But the main thing the elderly lady could understand was that she had a great-grandson, and that very soon they would come to visit her. "Grandma, there's someone else I need to introduce to you. His name is Michael. He's my husband and Chris's father. I love him very much. He's very nice, and you're sure to love him too." As Jenna spoke, Michael and Heather breathed a sigh of relief. Years had passed, and nothing could be changed. They had their own families now. The main thing was that now it was clear what had happened to Jenna, and that all 4 of them would remain friends. However, there was still David, so they both looked at him almost simultaneously and realized that there would be no problems on his part either. David accepted this difficult situation and was not going to ruin Jenna's family, especially since he had his beloved Heather and was waiting for her to give him an heir. A week later, they were all standing together on Mrs. Fox's doorstep. Sunday family dinners were sacred, and now they had a bigger family than before. And at the head of the table, of course, was little Chris, a family sweetheart and such a long-awaited great-grandson for the elderly grandma.